Helga's eyebrows disappeared into her hairline and Finn laughed out loud. Wow, Finn, I knew you were adventurous but wow. Kidding, kidding. Geez, my dad would kill me. Closest I got was wine and that was purely accidental, and disgusting. PSH, only you, fearless Finn. Finn rolled his eyes. Only you, Bones. Helga grinned at her dubbed nickname. She fingered the bone necklace around her neck fondly and grinned when she saw the cord around his neck. What's that? Oh, Finn showed her the necklace. Bennen gave it to me last night. Helga ran a finger across the cool, smooth surface. It was a pale gold in the morning light. That's cool. He's so cool. You have no idea. Helga sighed heavily, laying back against the cobblestone with her eyes skyward. Finn forced himself to look forward instead of down at her shapely, womanly form. He shook his head to clear it, hoping she hadn't noticed. You're so obvious, you know that. About? Finn asked, but blushed madly at the wolfish grin she definitely inherited from her mother. Gods! He muttered when she cackled madly, another motherly trait she'd received. Shaking his head, Finn thought of something to change the subject. Do you want to go hunting? I saw some deer earlier. I thought you'd never ask. Hiccup and Adriana didn't enjoy waking up early, but with the amount of sleep they had gotten in the previous day and night, it wasn't as difficult as usual. When they packed up and got moving, Adriana looked around. It's warmer, she said after a few minutes. I guess we flew south. We did, yes. Last time I was here, it was the middle of summer and parts of it were sweltering. Hiccup peered around them with narrowed eyes. Adriana furrowed her brow. It's actually kind of nice. I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting. A rocky, God's-forsaken heap. Hiccup suggested. That's probably how we made it sound. Sort of, yeah. Adriana shrugged. But it's not. I guess with all I'd heard about it, I should have known that. Slave labor, Addie. Hiccup gently placed a hand on her shoulder. That's why it looks so nice. But the people here are anything but. Adriana shivered at the thought of kind of people who would buy other people, treat them as property instead of fellow human beings. She thought of Benen's life here, probably walking the same paths they walked now and forced to contribute to the island's deceptive beauty. How could anyone treat someone as kind and sweet as him so brutally, so disrespectfully? Even though Finn drove her nuts a lot of the time, she still couldn't imagine someone beating a child as young as he was back then. Physical punishments had been incredibly rare in the Haddock household when she and Finn were children, reserved only for the very worst and most dangerous behaviors, but beating someone for not cleaning the floor fast enough, or for getting the wrong items at the store, or simply for being too weak to do some of the work, as Benen had been toward the end. It was enough to make her sick. Why don't you try to stop it? She asked her father after a few minutes. You stopped the Dragon War. That was different. Hiccup sighed deeply. I stopped my people and the people around us from killing thousands of peaceful dragons. But I can't stop people from all over the world who still do. In this case, slave handlers and people who buy slaves know that these are people. They don't care. To show them that what they are doing is wrong would have no effect on them. And the slave trade is massive. There's no way our little collection of islands could go up against an entire world full of people who think that this is okay. Hiccup looked sadly at a young man in chains who was walking behind his master. We can't win this, Addie. The best we can do is show others that we don't need slaves to be successful. You intervened when Finn was taken. Adriana countered. Yes, I did. And I freed the only other slave I could. Hiccup placed a hand on his daughter's back. Maybe one day, a force more powerful than we are can put an end to this. We can only hope. Adriana replied, her eyes still on the slave they had seen earlier. Suddenly, the slave's master shouted something they couldn't quite make out. He got out a whip and Adriana screamed in horror when he brought it down on the young man's back. Hiccup grabbed her arm to keep her from running over. Don't you see what he's doing? Adriana whimpered through gritted teeth, her eyes misting with tears. Addie. How could someone do that? Adriana continued, her voice raising in pitch. Why isn't anyone doing anything? she added as she looked around at the crowd of people forming in the area. Addie, listen to me. Hiccup turned her to face him. If you do try to intervene, you could get arrested. Or beaten. I don't care. I do. Hiccup brushed her bangs out of her eyes. You can't stop this by yourself. But if there ever is an army strong enough to rise up against this, I would join it in a heartbeat. And maybe you could form one someday. But for today, your job is the same as mine, find those berries. She nodded and he looked around. We're in some kind of marketplace. See if you can find some of those berries for sale. Keep Lily nearby and holler if you need me. Okay, the girl agreed. Thanks to her size, Lily followed Adriana from the edges of the marketplace. It was definitely best to keep her away from the many booths and carts because she could easily destroy them with one swipe of her tail. Adriana got out her money bag and looked around for someone who could sell her the berries she sought. She scanned the area with her eyes, finding several vegetable merchants and a few selling little trinkets. She was briefly tempted by a lovely purple necklace, but she reminded herself that she had more important things to do. And then she caught sight of a merchant selling some already cooked meat. It all smelled delicious and gave her an idea. She quickly walked over and purchased the tastiest looking section of chicken. The slave she had seen before had been left on his own to buy some things for his master. Adriana sighed in relief and hurried over to him. For you, she said, offering him the piece of chicken. The slave shook his head, but she placed it in his hand. You deserve it. Tears filled the young man's eyes as he quickly ate what was probably one of the best meals of his life. Adriana helped him wipe down his mouth and hands so his master would never know what had happened. Gracious Tibiago, he whispered. Adriana smiled warmly at him before turning away, satisfied that the master still hadn't seen anything. She quickly prayed that he never would. As the girl walked into a slightly more crowded part of the marketplace, she found herself face to face with a man older than her father who walked with a cane. His steel grey eyes made her extremely uncomfortable, especially when they traced her developing curves. Are you lost? He asked with a smile that gave her shivers. I can help you find your way. I'm fine. Adriana said a bit too quickly. Thank you though. Oh, I insist. Pretty young lady like you could get lost without a man to show her where to go. Ratri grabbed her upper arm, making her gasp in surprise. No, really, I'm fine. Get your hands off my daughter, came a loud voice to her left. Adriana looked over and saw her father bounding over, looking absolutely, and a bit scarily, livid. He stopped short when he made eye contact with the man, his face reddening with suppressed rage. You, the man with the cane bellowed. You cheated me. For a moment, Adriana was completely bewildered. And then it hit her. The cane, the cold grey eyes. She quickly wrenched her arm out of his grip while he was distracted. I paid for my son. If you lost the money, that's your problem. Hiccup hissed through his teeth. Come on, Addie. Ratri. Adriana said out loud without thinking. You're the scum who beat Benen and my brother. Watch your tongue, girl. Ratri said warningly, his eyes narrowed and his lips pursed. Or I'll have it removed. Addie, let's go. Benen served you for years and you still beat him day in and day out. He is the sweetest, kindest, most wonderful man I know. And my brother was a child. How do you live with yourself? Adriana raged, her hands balled at her sides. You are nothing but a filthy coward and you deserve to. Smack. Adriana felt a sensation of white-hot pain flash across her cheek as her body was thrown sideways. As she landed heavily on the ground, she heard an outraged roar and caught sight of her dragon, ignited and running at top speed toward the trio. Hiccup leaped in front of her, holding his arms out. Hey! Calm down, girl, he shouted over her angry roars. He turned to Ratri, his gaze scathing. I suggest you run because I can only hold her off for so long. Ratri hobbled off, cursing loudly. Hiccup barely kept Lily contained, requiring the help of Toothless to keep her from flying off and ripping the man to shreds. She was making quite a spectacle of herself, her wings outstretched, her whole body aflame, her tail knocking over stands and sending their contents flying. Soon, they could hear the others talking, some in Latin and others in Norse. Susaro est quadraco. Is that a night fury? Kia meridi positus zebai. My cabbages. Hiccup ignored these comments as he finally succeeded in calming the monstrous nightmare down. He reached down and helped his daughter up, but there was a fire in his eyes she had never seen before. We need to talk, he said through gritted teeth, marching her through the marketplace and apologizing to as many people as he could. As soon as they were in a somewhat secluded area, Adriana spoke up. Dad, I couldn't just let him get away with what he... Yes, Addie, you could. Hiccup roared, causing her to jump. You are lucky Lily didn't kill him, because then there would have been hell to pay. Do you have any idea how foolish that was? He deserved it after what he did. Adriana shouted, her face reddening and her hands shaking with fury. He's a monster. I don't disagree. Hiccup growled. But you can't say things like that to people. And now we can't shop at that marketplace, so our only chance of finding those berries is to search all over the island. He sighed deeply and massaged his temple. I thought you were more mature than that. Well, clearly I believe in standing up to people who hurt others. Adriana straightened herself up so that she looked taller. Unlike some people. Hiccup's head shot up. What's that supposed to mean? Figure it out. Adriana turned on her heel and stomped away, her breathing ragged and her muscles tense. Hiccup stood still and watched her stalk off with a frown on his face. For the first time since they had left, he was beginning to feel like he was missing something. His daughter had looked so scathingly at him. Almost like he too had done something wrong. And he had a feeling that it had nothing to do with Ratri. Rather than try to figure it out until he was mentally drained, he decided to wait it out. Surely she would tell him what was wrong. She told him everything, didn't she? He didn't usually have bad ideas. But hunting had been a very, very bad idea. He shot a buck, Helga shot a doe. They even shot a few ducks on their way back to the Great Hall. The cooks had been thrilled when they returned with new meat for the sickly village to share. But Finn hadn't taken into account that once he killed something, he'd have to drag it home. And of course, with his sleep-deprived mind, he hadn't thought to bring Tornado along. The teenagers had been gone for 2 hours, what with tracking the deer, shooting the deer, waiting for the deer to die, gutting the deer, and then trekking all the way back to the top of the village with said deer. All in all, by the time they returned, Finn was exhausted. A headache had effectively blossomed halfway through the trip, and now his head pounded with every step. His body felt heavy and sluggish, and it felt like a chore to take each step. Despite this, Finn launched full swing into another day. He helped the volunteering cooks make venison stew, helped pass out bowls of food to everyone, and then took time to eat a late lunch with Astrid, who was still bedridden. He could only eat half his food, which he pinned down to his lack of sleep. He was standing to leave when his mother grabbed his wrist. Finn. Astrid turned away to cough and then said, "Why don't you stay with me? You look exhausted." Finn shook his head stubbornly. "Too much to do, Mom. I'll check on you in a bit." He walked away before she could argue further. He didn't see her share a concerned look with Binnen. The teenager walked past the Jorgensen family with curious eyes. Inga was still unconscious and her parents still hadn't left her side. Snotlout looked blank and terrified, Heather looked pale and depressed. Finn walked on, forcing himself to look away. He walked up to Mara, waiting patiently until she was done speaking with Gobber, who gave him a concerned expression. The healer turned at the blacksmith's gaze and she too raised her eyebrows at Finn. "Is there anything you need me to do?" Finn asked, trying not to look tired. Gobber pursed his lips and looked at Mara as she firmly said, "Yes, I want you to go to bed." Finn blinked, wondering for a second if he'd heard wrong. He stared at her blankly, waiting for the punchline until she pressed her hands on his shoulders. "Finn. Go to bed. I mean it." He shook his head, "There's too much to." "Yes, I know." Mara nodded. "But you're not doing anyone any favors by running yourself into the ground like this. I bet if you were to sit down with your mother, you'd be out in seconds." "I slept for half the night, Mara, I'm fine." Finn turned away. "It's fine, I'll find something to do." Gobber began to follow him, but Mara set a hand on his arm. "Leave him be. We can't force him. Just keep an eye on him." Gobber sighed regretfully but nodded, catching Benen's eye from across the room. Finn kept himself busy with odd jobs here and there for a while after that. He was increasingly quiet, but when he did speak, he was typically short and sarcastic. After a while, people stopped trying to talk to him. Benen sat at the same table as him, watching with a careful eye as Finn struggled with a knot in some netting he was trying to fix for a carrier. Finn let his mind wander as he worked. Or at least he liked to tell himself he was working hard, but in fact he knew he was moving slower than usual. In his mind, he kept telling himself to keep moving, keep working, people need this done, Mara needs this, Mom needs more water, Mr. Larson needs another blanket, give this note to the Jorgensens from their boys, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Finally sick of messing with the knot, Finn resolved to just give it back to Mara. He spun out of his seat to stand, and the room shifted. Finn reached out and steadied himself at the edge of the table, shaking his head to clear it. That was weird, he thought. He took a few steps forward, trying to figure out who he'd gotten the net from. It wasn't Mara, was it Hawk the fisherman? Gunner, no, maybe Mulch or Bucket. The room shifted again and he blinked hard, trying to focus on the voices around him. When did walking get so difficult? Who has the net from? What was he doing again? Suddenly, everything felt off. Sounds echoed, lights winkled in and out of focus, faces blurred, walls and tables shifted. Finn's center of gravity plummeted and his knees buckled. Catch him, catch him, catch him. Benen yelled out to anyone as Finn collapsed. Finn vaguely felt his forehead knock into a shoulder, but only gave a stifled miles per hour in response. He felt the arms around his body and then the cold hardness of the ground against his back. He tried in confusion to make out the blurring shapes over him, but everything began to spin once again. He moaned and closed his eyes. Finn felt someone pat his cheek and could vaguely hear Benen's echoing voice. A cold sensation touched his lips a moment later and it trickled down the side of his neck, but he couldn't make himself respond to it. To anything at all. He felt everything slipping away, feeling, vision, then hearing. The dark of unconsciousness pulled him under just as he heard Benen's voice echo, "Stay with me." Chapter 13, The Final Ingredient. Chapter text. Hiccup couldn't sleep. True, they had gotten the berries they needed and flown to Healer's Island, arriving just after midnight. He needed to sleep for sure but he couldn't force his body to relax. His eyes remained open and staring at the top of the tent as he drummed his fingers on his chest and listened to his daughter's deep breathing next to him. She had fallen asleep just minutes ago, he could tell when she wasn't faking it, but the longer his brain remained wide awake, the more convinced he was that he would be up all night. Then again, after a day like that, it was a wonder Adriana had fallen asleep at all. The haunted look in her eyes wasn't one Hiccup would forget easily, not after seeing it more times than he could count as she was growing up. The look she got just after snapping out of flashbacks when she was little or even sometimes when she thought no one was paying any attention to her. Something was very, very wrong, that much he knew for sure, but he didn't know what it was, so his odds of fixing it were minimal. Then again, she didn't seem too enthusiastic about him putting any effort into it. As he laid back against his mat, Toothless snoring quietly next to his head, he went over the day's events. "They're here," Adriana said after a very silent day of hunting and looking through even the thorniest of bushes in the darkest areas of the woods. Finally. Hiccup hurried over, nearly tripping on several tree roots as he went. "Are you sure?" His daughter got out the list and gave it a quick look. "That's them." Hiccup frowned. "Just to be sure, let me see. We've been looking so long, I don't want to go back and find out they're the wrong ones." "It's fine." Adriana crumpled the paper in her haste to return it to her back. "It's them, Dad." Hiccup's long arms and quick reflexes served him well as he reached out and took the paper from her hand. Her eyes widened in horror as she nearly dove for it, but her father's height difference of over a foot proved to make retrieving it impossible. Toothless, sensing something neither human could quite understand, stepped between the desperate girl and her father. "Toothless, get out of the way," she grunted as she tried to push him to the side. As his daughter fought his dragon, Hiccup's eyes scanned the list. Adriana had been right about the berries, these matched the description and picture exactly. But beneath the list of ingredients was the name of an herb Hiccup had never heard of, the Potens sanationis plant. The Potens sanationis plant is the most powerful herb in existence, to our knowledge. It can only be found in a continent many miles to the east of us. Few traders have ventured that far, but those that do pick up this herb in bulk because it can heal many sicknesses at any point, even moments before death. While it is not required for the cure, it is the only thing that will save everyone. The more you put in your cure, the more powerful it will be. Another important thing to note is that this herb's effectiveness as a cure never decreases with its age. As long as it is preserved, it will be every bit as useful no matter how long ago it was harvested. Hiccup stared at the page for several seconds. The name of the herb had been underlined 3 times, making it impossible to miss. Yet Adriana had acted like it didn't exist. There was no way she could possibly have missed it, so what was the problem? I know what you're thinking, Adriana said, almost in answer to his unspoken question. But we can't go flying across the world to get any. No. Hiccup said slowly. So why didn't you let me see the list? I just didn't want you to be a hero. Adriana shook her head. But now we've found the berries we're looking for. Soon as we get what we need from Healer's Island, we can go back to Berk and cure everyone. Her false smile and the haunted look in her eyes made him pause before speaking up again. You know where we can find some, don't you? Adriana froze as she was using her dagger to cut off full clusters of berries. She shut her eyes tightly and shook her head. I've never heard of it. You're lying. Hiccup said quietly. Adriana sighed deeply. So what if I am? I want to know why her father looked between the paper and her a few times, his brow furrowed in confusion. It's not important. Clearly it is. Adriana's shaking fingers caused her to cut the palm of her hand rather than the branch. She hissed in pain and quickly reached into her bag for a bandage. The cut didn't look deep at all, in fact it almost didn't need the bandage, but she made quite a show of wrapping it up and Hiccup decided to let the subject drop. At least for now. Nothing about that afternoon had made any sense. Why in the world had Adriana acted that way? Why wouldn't she tell him anything? Why had she been so quiet on the entire flight there and while they set up camp? The subject had to have triggered something, but what? The snuffle of Lily from across the tent brought Hiccup back to the present. He still had a small lamp lit to keep the tent warm, which he intended to blow out when he felt sleep beginning to overtake him. But it continued to burn, illuminating the green surroundings that were the tent, the brown blankets atop himself and his daughter, the black scales of his dragon's back, and Adriana herself. His daughter's face was half buried in the pillow and her hair was strewn around it like some kind of weird spider web, but she was peaceful. And sometimes that was the only time she was ever peaceful anymore. Her nightmares seemed to have ended, or she wasn't telling him about them, but there always seemed to be a subtext behind everything she said lately. Or perhaps he was reading too deeply into it. She used to tell him everything, from the way she felt when a butterfly landed on her finger to how upset she was after a spat with Eric to how scared she was when she got lost. The list could be endless some days and it took all his energy to wind her down so he could put her to bed. Then again, when was the last time that had happened? If memory served him, these kinds of evenings happened less and less often. And perhaps they had stopped altogether without him realizing it. Adriana took a deep breath and he was once more snapped to the present. He stared at his daughter for a few minutes. He could see her resemblance to him in an instant. Her long eyelashes fluttered every once in a while and Hiccup wondered if she was dreaming. Aside from nightmares, what did she dream about? Did she ever dream about him? The gods knew she popped into his dreams more time than he could count. Some were sweet moments like playing with dolls or snuggling in front of a fire, but others, well, they were less pleasant. But after everything he'd been through as a parent, those dreams weren't surprising. She had faced horrors the likes of which he couldn't begin to imagine. And yet he had no idea what had happened because she never once divulged the details of her nightmares, only her feelings about them. At first he'd let it slip. But now, as he watched her sleep peacefully a few feet away, he wanted to know everything. He just hoped that the everything he wanted to know wasn't as bad as he was beginning to suspect it would be. Silence other than the crackling of fire from the nearby fire pit and the occasional cough from a mat. Eric sat with his back against a pillar, holding his father's hand, his thoughts roving. His mother sat across from him with a placid expression and a rigid back. Only her fingers moved quickly at their work in patching a hole in some trousers. He'd watched her work tirelessly for hours and vaguely wondered how her fingers hadn't bled yet. His oldest sister Magnus, the next child after Gustav, gently hummed from her seat beside him. Erik snuck a quick glance at her and found her already watching him. "What?" he mumbled, turning back to his father's prone form. "You should sleep." "Can't." Magnus smiled gently. "They'll get here." Erik sighed and she reinforced the comment. "They will." "It's been 4 days, Mags," Erik huffed to her. He looked up at her with doubtful eyes. Despite their 6-year age difference, he'd always been closest to Magnus. He'd always had Gustav to goof off with, and there were times he'd stick up for the youngest boy. His other brother Nicholas was usually glued to their mother's side, too reserved and opinionated to even attempt a relationship with the blonde squirt. And the only thing he had in common with his sister Aud, the middle child, was the fact that they were the daddy's boy and girl. They could get along and hold conversation well enough. But none of the others held a candle to his relationship with Magnus. Since he was a toddler, he remembered Magnus coming into the house after a day outside with her friends and him running to hug her. She'd always play with him like none of the other kids would. And the older he got, and even when she got married and moved out of the house a little over a year ago, she still pursued a relationship with him. She'd stop by the house to talk with him and ask how he was doing. Sometimes she'd stop by the haddocks if he was hanging out there, and she'd stick around to converse with Astrid, or even Hiccup if he were home. Other than his father, Magnus was the only family member he'd run to. 4 days, Erik repeated, quieter, turning back to their father. His ragged breathing still made the blankets shudder. "What if we don't have a lot of time?" Magnus frowned and slid closer to her little brother, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "No, we don't. But we need to have faith that the chief and Anna will be back soon." Erik opened his mouth to reply when a sudden anxious shout erupted nearby. "Catch him, catch him, catch him." Magnus straightened and looked around in confusion as a small tussle was heard. Erik caught sight of Mara sprint across the hall as a small crowd of people began to gather around a table a few yards away. What's going on?" Erik asked pensively. Magnus trained her eyes on the scene, unable to respond. Urgent voices sounded from the group until Mara's firm voice finally told people to back up. First, Erik saw Binnen stand from the huddle with worry plastered on his pale face. Then, surprisingly, Magnus' husband Gregory stood from the center with a red-headed boy in his arms, limp as a rag doll. Magnus gasped in recognition, but it wasn't until Mara and Gregory came closer to their area that he realized who the boy was. "Finn." A sharp gasp interrupted the Eriks when Astrid saw her son from the next pillar over. Erik watched in horror as Gregory laid Finn down beside his mother's mat. Binnen sat on his haunches behind Finn, his hands on the teenager's head gently while Mara busied herself with equipment. Astrid brushed Finn's bangs off his forehead. "Finn. Finn. Come on baby, say something." Here Mara helped Binnen lift Finn's head to put a cup of water to his lips. "Come on, Finn." The healer murmured, quickly setting the cup down beside her and checking Finn's vital signs. Astrid looked to be on the verge of tears and kept coughing pitifully over her shoulder. Binnen chewed his lip nervously, which Erik had never seen before. He hadn't realized Magnus had wrapped her arms around him tighter and pulled him closer to her chest protectively. The Larsen boy continued to watch as Mara and Astrid tried to revive his friend, but it was becoming clear that Finn wasn't going to wake up. Mara finally opened Finn's slack mouth with her fingers and inspected his tongue with a clean, flat piece of wood. She sighed with pursed lips. "He's got it." "No." Astrid whimpered, wrapping her hands around Finn's face and resting her forehead against his. Binnen placed his hand on her back comfortingly. Astrid sat up with a look of terror. "He's burning up." "Mara, what do we do?" "I have something to give him for now, but the problem is getting it down his throat without drowning him." Mara turned to her medical supplies and quickly made a liquid concoction of herbs, spices and a spoonful of honey. She stirred it together and again they lifted Finn's head. The brown liquid trickled down the sides of his mouth and seeped into his shirt, but he gave no response to the liquid whatsoever. "Mara, he has to drink it, what do we?" Astrid. Mara rested a firm hand on the woman's shoulder and declared, "It's all right. Okay. He's just unconscious because he worked himself too hard and got the sickness as a result. He's exhausted, so the sickness is taking its toll at a faster rate." Mara turned back to a bag and pulled out a small siphon with a strip of very thin netting over top. Eric watched as she carefully eased the thin end into the corner of Finn's mouth and poured the makeshift medicine onto the netting. He knew from watching her do this with his father that the remaining herbs collected at the top while the liquid drained to the bottom, and into the patient's mouth. Mara poured slowly and only a small amount at a time. There was a collective sigh of relief when Finn's natural instinct to swallow kicked in and he drank the full cup of medicine. "All right," Mara sighed, setting the tools aside. "I want a cot set up beside Astrid's and I want to know immediately if he wakes up, coughs, or is in pain. Astrid, back on your mat, please." Eric realized Binnen had nodded to every instruction and Astrid scowled. "Mara." "Astrid." Mara interrupted and stood. "He'll be right by your side. I don't want you to move." Eric watched Gregory and Binnen quickly make a mat beside Astrid's, and then carefully move Finn onto it. He still made no sounds or movements. Astrid sat beside him, her lower half still half pooled in blankets. She blinked heavily and cleared her throat constantly, fighting the cough in her lungs just like everyone else. Magnus stirred beside him and he jerked, having forgotten she had been there. "Astrid," the blonde looked up and his sister asked, "Is there anything you need?" Astrid moved to shake her head but paused. Her lips parted and her request came softly. "I need some paper and a quill. Or charcoal, something to write with." She turned to Binnen with an urgent look. "I need to send a message to Hiccup. They need to hurry." As if to second that notion, Olaf coughed hoarsely. His body racked and he winced in his sleep painfully. Eric jerked forward to see if he would wake up, but he remained asleep after nearly a minute of discomfort. He sighed and sat back against the pillow once more, giving his mother a single glance. A flare of annoyance shot through him at how uncaring she seemed to be at all of this, but he gave Magnus a short smile when she stood to fulfill Astrid's request. His teal eyes darted across the short distance to see her stroking Finn's face sadly, Binnen's hands resting loosely on the sides of his boy's head. Both looked weary, exhausted, and disheartened. This only made him feel worse as his father gave another painful cough. Surely if the strongest people on the island were discouraged, what could he do to keep his fears at bay? Hiccup was silent as he and Adriana gathered all the necessary ingredients. It didn't take long, only 20 minutes or so, but neither of them were paying much attention to what they were doing. As Adriana put a cutting of grass in the bag of ingredients, Hiccup took a deep breath and opened his mouth. "You have to tell me," he said as calmly as he could. "What? You know what?" Hiccup was slightly firmer. "You're keeping something from me. We have the ingredients. We can go home." Adriana shut the bag and shouldered it without looking at her father. "Addy, please, this could save a lot of people." Hiccup pleaded in a slightly hoarse voice. "Do you know where we can find this plant?" Adriana didn't respond. She stared at her feet for a few seconds before turning to her dragon and attaching the bag to her saddle. Hiccup slowly approached her and put a hand on her shoulder. "Please, Addy," he quietly begged. "No. Addy. I said no. Now let's go back to Berk." Adriana made a move to mount her dragon but Hiccup grabbed her arm and held it firmly. "Let me go. Not until you tell me where to find the plant." Hiccup hated doing this. He felt like he was forcing her to relive something, though he didn't know what. But his loyalty to his people had won out. "You know something. You have to tell me." Adriana struggled but his grip was too strong, her arm finally went limp and she shut her eyes. "I can't." "Why not?" "I just can't. You could save so many lives, Addy." Hiccup's patience was beginning to dwindle. "What could be so bad that you can't tell me where to find it? Let me go. Tell me." Adriana suddenly wrenched her arm free and ran in the opposite direction. Hiccup, surprised at this sudden action, had to act fast before she was too far to chase with only one good leg. Fortunately, his reflexes were quick as ever, she got only a few feet away before he caught her. She let out an indignant scream as he grabbed her shoulders and turned her to face him. "It's okay," he said in a gentle voice. "You can tell me anything. Not this." Adriana thrashed around in his arms but he refused to budge. "Please let me go." "Did you see someone use it?" he asked. She didn't answer. She stopped moving and went limp in his arms. Her whole body had begun to shiver and she dropped her head so he couldn't even look at her face anymore. A timid whimper became audible after several tense seconds. "Don't make me go back." The question Hiccup wanted to ask least of all began to press into his mind, slowly enveloping all else as he tried to think of something, anything, other than that. But there it was. At the forefront as everything else ran out. Was it Trista? He had said it. A name that made his blood boil with rage at even the mention, even the thought of mentioning it, but a necessary utterance in this case. Adriana exhaled slowly, shakily, and then nodded. Hiccup forced his arms not to tighten against hers, though he felt as if his heart was being squeezed to dust. The woman who had stolen his daughter's innocence and, in some ways, her very childhood, seemed to spring back from the grave to haunt them again. But this time he had had enough. This time was going to be the last time. "Addie, that was 10 years ago." Hiccup reminded her, his voice hoarse but as soft as he could make it. "She can't hurt you now. Don't make me go back." Adriana shook her head. "Please. I think you should." Hiccup gently placed 2 fingers on her chin and turned her head up to face him. She kept her eyes shut but offered little resistance. "Addie, this is a big opportunity. You can conquer this right now." "No. I know it's hard. But it's time to let it go and move on. Isn't that what you want?" Hiccup sighed deeply. "Look. I don't know where she kept it. Or if she had it crushed so I wouldn't be able to tell which one it is. Or even if it's still there. But you remember. You could be a hero, Addie. You could save people." Adriana shook her head. Her head told her that her father's words were true. But her heart constricted and her whole body seemed to panic when she as much as entertained the thought of going back and facing what she had seen. Of living those nightmares again. She wanted to help Olaf and Svala and everyone else who had gotten sick so badly. She stood still and sniffled once before nodding shakily. "That's my girl." Hiccup kissed her forehead and led her to the dragons, who were watching the scene with interest. As Adriana mounted Lily, her whole body tensed. Lily seemed to feel this and made a comforting sort of noise before taking off behind Hiccup and Toothless. The girl shut her eyes and prayed for courage as she hurtled to the most terrifying place she had ever been. Eric felt himself nodding off halfway through the night. The painted stone pillar dug into the back of his skull and he kept having a knee-jerk reaction when his head would slump sideways. He'd snap his head back up, frown and readjust his position in the attempt to fall asleep without lying down. He was unsuccessful thus far, but he finally got his head angled into a somewhat comfortable position. That's when he felt the rustle of material by his leg and then the gentle touch of fingers on his cheek. He flinched and squinted at the offensive appendage, but froze when he saw his father's brown eyes gazing back at his, exhausted and baggy, but alert. Eric sat up, opening his mouth to speak when Olaf rested a finger on his lips. "Sure." Olaf carefully glanced at the rest of the sleeping family around them. "Sleeping?" Eric carefully wrapped his arms around his father and buried his face in his chest. "Dad. You're awake." For now, Olaf whispered, brushing a hand through his youngest son's blonde hair. Once Eric sat back up, he promptly asked, "What's happened?" Eric scowled at the blankets. "There's a sickness. At least half of the village is sick. Chief Hiccup and Annie went to get ingredients for the cure almost 5 days ago, a couple of people have already recovered though." 5 days. Olaf mused, his raspy voice almost squeaking from misuse. Eric nodded. "We hope they'll get back with the cure soon. It's taking a long time but..." Eric paused, eyes searching out Astrid and Benen's sleeping forms nearby. "Mrs. H.R. Astrid. She sent Hiccup a letter today, asking him to hurry." Olaf's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because." Eric swallowed. "Because Finn is sick." Olaf frowned sadly and Eric felt the need to continue, I mean, A lot of people are sick, so they don't mean it as oh, Finn is sick, so now it's imperative they return quicker. They adjust. I don't know. I know they don't mean it that way. I just don't think they've really been communicating with them since they left. Olaf nodded. They probably took that as an opportunity to send a message. I mean, they didn't send a message when Astrid got sick 2 days ago. Astrid is sick? Olaf asked in surprise. Well, she doesn't get sick often. Neither does Hiccup, actually. They've both got strong immunities. Eric sighed. I feel so bad for Finn. You should have seen him, Dad. I haven't seen anyone work so hard for so long. Even Mara has had to stop and rest from time to time to keep up with everything, but Finn, he refused to stop. If he fell asleep, he'd get mad at himself and work even harder to make up for lost time. Olaf smiled. He'll be a good ch. A harsh cough interrupted him and he faced the other direction. The cough lasted only a few seconds, but Eric knew it was uncomfortable. Olaf sighed, Chief someday. Yeah, if he makes it. Eric glanced at his father in surprise at what he'd just said without thinking, but shook it off. I didn't see it, but I guess he was working himself too hard or something today and he just passed out. Collapsed. Greg brought him to Astrid's mat over there and they couldn't wake him up. Eric paused to sigh. He's been feverish ever since. No matter what Mara gives him, they can't shake it. Olaf frowned throughout the entire explanation. When Eric remained silent, he calmly replied, he'll be all right. Hiccup will bring back the cure and Finn will be just fine. Eric smiled for the first time in days. Just like you. Olaf's smile faltered for a moment and he sighed, patting Eric's hand gently. I dearly hope so, son. I can't wait until this week is over, Eric mused. So many people are sick, too many accidents. Accidents? Well, Finn's episode today, and... Eric paused with a frown. Inga's accident. She crashed her dragon yesterday morning and, she had some sort of episode later that day. Episode? Her body was shaking and she frothed at the mouth. Eric shivered. I didn't see it but I heard people freaking out. Olaf sighed. Poor girl. Eric nodded, staring down at the blankets again with a morose expression. He didn't notice his father's gaze turn to him, taking in details with his brown eyes. The dark circles under his eyes, the slouched posture, the firm grip on his father's hand, the noticeable difference in his son's weight. You need to sleep. Eric blinked at him and one shoulder bobbed. I'll sleep for days when you're better. You should sleep now. I'm fine. I'm sure that's what Finn said. Finn was working non-stop, Dad. I've been sitting on my rear. Eric smirked with a slight eye roll. I'm more tired from lack of activity than anything. Then go do something. Olaf smiled like leaving his side was the easiest thing in the world. Take Charger around for a flight, I'm sure after 5 days he's going barking mad. Eric pursed his lips. He truly hadn't given his dragon much thought these last few days. He should probably go home and at least bring him back to the Great Hall. His green deadly Nada would prove to be a more comfortable backrest than this pole, for sure. Then again, he didn't want to think about how much room he'd take up and how rambunctious he'd probably be at finally receiving attention. His name wasn't Charger for nothing. Probably best to just wait until everything is back to normal, Eric finally mused, scratching his scruffy cheek. Wouldn't do. He frowned in surprise at the sensation and ran a hand across his face. Olaf gave a knowing grin and Eric breezed through his thought, wouldn't do to have a hyper dragon in a hall full of sick people. Olaf couldn't hold back the comment any longer. Finally getting rid of the peach fuzz, I see. Eric rolled his eyes with a snort, running both hands on his cheeks and chin. He hadn't even noticed that he was starting to actually get some manly scruff. It was even on the underside of his chin a bit. He wondered for a short moment if he could grow a full beard, that would shock Adriana right out of her saddle for sure. But then he remembered some of the older boys growing random patches and thinking they looked like something amazing, and in reality they looked quite silly. All those snickers and under-the-breath comments from the older men, nope. At least he was blonde, but he'd be shaving just in case. Olaf seemed to read his mind, chuckling lightly at his youngest's facial expressions to match his thoughts. The man sighed serenely and shook his head lovingly. Already grown up? Eric shook his head with half a smile. Hardly a man yet. No, not yet. Olaf agreed. But you've got something special inside that none of my other children have. Eric paused, unsure what to expect. Olaf poked Eric's chest with a single finger with a gentle smile and said, "Compassion." Eric frowned. Compassion. You help those who need help. You befriend those who have none because you see they're lonely. There aren't many people who have the strength or courage to do that. Are you talking about Annie? Olaf gave a mild shrug. Possibly. Dad, we've been friends since we were little. I'd hardly call that friendship based on compassion. No. Olaf raised an eyebrow. He gazed at his son non-critically for a moment before he settled on a decision. Let me tell you a story. Okay. There once was a little boy. Quiet, reserved, cautious. Olaf began. He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, all older than him. Eric gave him a detached look. Dad, does the story have to be about him? Sure, you'll miss an important detail. Olaf chided with a twinkle of mischief in his eye, and continued, this boy didn't have many friends his age, and those who were close by didn't seem to catch his eye. He was too busy drawing pictures and coloring, playing with tools and leather in his father's shed, things like that. Until one day, it was his birthday. His 5th birthday. Eric frowned, wishing his father wouldn't bring up this particular day. But he didn't stop him from plowing through the story. This boy, you see, was born on Snoggletog. Brightest day of the year, perfect for celebrating joy and happiness, but even better with his own special time mixed in. He was so excited the night before. Olaf paused, a frown forming on his face. But the boy awoke to the sound of warning bells and horns. An emergency had taken place and everyone was to assemble in the Great Hall. A kidnapping. The little granddaughter of the chief was missing, and no one knew who had taken her, or where she'd been taken. Olaf paused, letting the information sink in. Eric could still remember the fear that shook his little world that day. That little boy was terrified. Some terrible person had taken a child from her home in the middle of the night. Those days she was missing, he wouldn't sleep without a light on in the room. In fact, he barely slept at all. Dad. Eric whispered. He couldn't get it out of his head. Most children knew something bad had happened, but none of them weighed the true gravity of the situation. This boy was smart and he saw cruelty in the world long before he needed to. But Olaf paused and a hint of a smile formed on his face. When that little girl was finally rescued, that boy was suddenly overcome with something. He couldn't stop talking about her. He'd seen her from time to time around the village and knew who she was, but never before had his parents realized just how much he seemed to know about her. While they wanted to keep him inside where it was safe, he nearly begged them to take him to the healers where she was being kept. Olaf paused again, his smile widening for just a moment. When asked why, that little boy said something that I never forgot. He said, she likes purple, and showed us a small drawing in purple that he wanted to give her. And that struck me as odd at first, because what does the color purple have to do with any of this? But then I realized, you'd been paying attention. You knew what she liked, what made her happy. And though you were terrified yourself for what had happened, though you really didn't know her, and though she was nearly broken by that woman's hand. Olaf's face split into a smile at last. You reached out to her. Eric swallowed thick, suddenly overcome with emotion that he normally never showed. Don't praise me, Dad. I was just a kid. A wiser kid than many adults that I've met in my day. Olaf sighed in exhaustion, resting a hand on his shoulder. But his smile didn't waver. Let me tell you something, Eric. Adriana needs love. And patience. And most of all, time. You know this almost better than anyone. Don't let anyone or anything get in the way of helping her heal. It's important. Eric blushed, breaking eye contact. You're turning it into something more. There's a proposal at the end of this story, I can feel it. Olaf breathed a laugh, too weary to chuckle. Perhaps, someday. Eric. He paused, blinking heavily, but he still seemed to take the time to choose his words carefully. I love you. You know that, right? Of course, Dad. Eric smiled, holding his father's hand in both of his. I would never doubt it. Olaf smiled and smudged his thumb against Eric's cheek. Good. Eric stifled a yawn and finally rubbed his eyes. His father smiled knowingly. Get some rest, son. Come here, I've got you. Eric finally gave in, laying down beside his father and resting his head on his shoulder. He felt his father's arm wrap around his back and gently pull him closer. Just before falling asleep, he mumbled, "Love you, Dad." Though Eric didn't hear it, Olaf gently whispered, "I love you too, son," and kissed his forehead before following him into a warm, comfortable sleep. It was quiet when they touched down. Hiccup looked back at Adriana on her dragon and was dismayed to see her eyes shut tight. She held on to Lily as if she was clinging to the only thing in the universe. Her father slowly walked over and put a hand on her upper arm. "Addie, it's okay." His voice was barely audible, but he forced it through. "She's not here. She's not anywhere." Adriana looked up and took in her snow-covered surroundings. Everything was exactly as she had dreamed it had been. The little hut standing stubbornly against the cold. The place in front of it in which a blade had been pressed to her throat. When she had learned that Trista's stories about Stoic had been true. When she had believed that her short life would be snuffed out at any moment. And the hut itself was old, much older than she remembered, but that was where. Her whole body tensed and she buried her face in her dragon's neck. Lily made a concerned sort of coo and the girl felt Toothless nudging her foot with his snout. Her father's hand hadn't left her upper arm and it was beginning to feel like sandpaper. As she listened to the still silence in the woods and heard her heart pumping so fast it was beginning to make her feel lightheaded, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't do this. "It's okay." Hiccup whispered. "It's not okay," she mumbled into the scales. "It's never going to be okay. Not if you don't face this. Come down, Addie." Hiccup motioned for Lily to lower her head and the monstrous nightmare, sensing that her human's father had her best interests in mind, obeyed. "Let's do this. Let's save everyone." Suddenly, Adriana's reflexes kicked in full blast and she clung even more tightly to her dragon. "No, no, 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 no," she mumbled. "Don't make me do this." This was too much. She was walking into her own nightmares. It was as if Trista already had her in her clutches again. The last 10 years vanished from her memory and suddenly she was a tiny child. And even her daddy's soft words were ultimately as meaningless as the promise he had made to protect her from everything she had faced. Hiccup finally took his hand off of her arm and faced the hut. He thought vaguely that if he could show his daughter that there was nothing to fear, he could fix this. He could save her from this nightmare once and for all. Even as he strode forward, he was becoming increasingly uneasy about what he was about to find. But nothing could have prepared him for the truth. As he pushed open the door and looked into the darkened hut, a strong, musty smell reached his nostrils. It was clear that no one had been inside for an incredibly long time. He took a step inside and a shape on the ground caught his eye. He lit his lamp and held it up so he could see it more clearly, and then stumbled back a few feet. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was a skeleton fully dressed and wearing a shiny but blood-stained white scarf. Its flesh appeared to have rotted away a long time ago. But the most horrifying thing of all was the axe was embedded in its back, its blade still reddish-brown from its victim's blood. After a few seconds of pure shock and horror, he turned and walked out of the house. Adriana was still clinging to Lily and refusing to look at anything at all. In a daze, he walked up to her and the first thing he thought to ask tumbled out of his mouth. Who was that? Adriana knew exactly to whom he was referring. The man who had looked so much like her father. The man whose story Trista had told her while his blood poured out of his limp, newly dead body. The man whose name made her blood run cold. And yet it could no longer be avoided. Hiccup needed answers. And so she took a deep, shaking breath and forced them out. He was an escapologist named Zebak. Chapter 14, Zebak. Chapter text. Zebak. Hiccup knew that name. He'd heard it before, a few times, actually. As he stared at his daughter, still clinging to her dragon, his mind began to race. Why was this name so familiar? Why did he connect it to Mayro? Had he met someone named Ziba there? And suddenly it hit him. Didn't Javan the deceiver, the man who had sold his son into slavery, call him Ziba? Yes, now that Hiccup thought about it, Javan's first words to him were an exclamation of surprise that he was still alive. A few people on Mayro had made the same mistake. He'd shrugged it off then, but now. You knew Ziba? He asked his daughter with wide eyes. There was a long pause before the girl nodded. Everything seemed to hit Hiccup at once. The mystery of this man, this name that had followed him for years, was about to be solved by his own daughter. A part of him didn't want to know what had happened. And yet he knew without a shadow of a doubt that he must know. It was a piece of Adriana's darkest hours that he had never known existed. A man whose name followed her too. The escapologist in the stories she had told 3 years ago, had they been true? The girl's face was hidden in her dragon's neck. Her whole body trembled and she let out little squeaks as she breathed far too fast. Her father strode forward and put one of his hands over hers. What happened in there? He whispered. What did she do to him? To you? The girl shook her head and tightened her hold on the monstrous nightmare. Hiccup sighed deeply and reached up to gently stroke her hair. A tiny twinge of pain radiated through his stump, but he hardly noticed in his concern for his daughter. Don't make me go back, she whimpered after a few silent seconds. Hey, Hiccup carefully tugged on her hair to get her attention without hurting her. Let's get out of here for a minute. You can tell me what happened. The memories flashed in Adriana's brain as if they had happened in the last 5 minutes instead of a full decade previously. She couldn't look at her father and she certainly couldn't talk about it. Addy. Hiccup whispered. I can't tell you. It's in the hut somewhere, but I don't remember where. Adriana mumbled into her dragon. Suddenly, a sharp pain radiated in Hiccup's stump. A few twinges had irritated him during the flight, but the elevation wasn't a good sign. Toothless made a cooing sound and nudged him as he hissed in pain. There's a storm coming, Hiccup said, gently rubbing his stump as the pain decreased. Soon. So go. Adriana muttered. Go find it. Addy. I can't go in there, she whimpered. Don't make me go in there. Hiccup would have stayed to argue, but the now constant discomfort in his leg was an indication of a heavy storm. He was going to have to go in on his own and hope he found it. Meanwhile, Adriana trembled as she clung to her dragon. She was never going to tell him, or anyone else, what had happened in there. What she had seen. It was a story she was going to take to her grave. She had expected her daddy to come by now. The strongest man in the world always came when she needed him. He always burst in and threw his arms around her. He always made her feel like everything was going to be okay. So where was he? He hadn't come when she had awakened with her hands and feet tied to the walls. He hadn't come when the old woman who claimed she was Poppy's sister had slapped her across the face. He hadn't come when the growls of her stomach were ignored by the woman, who laughed when she saw the girl suffering. And the most surprising thing of all was that this time, when she needed him more than she had ever needed anyone, he didn't answer her cries for help. Hours passed and darkness fell, but still he did not come. The old woman, who had introduced herself as Aunt Trista, was gone. She had spent a lot of the day either completely absent or writing on a large piece of wood and cutting it into pieces. Although while she was there, she had told the most horrible lies about Poppy. Adriana knew that her Poppy would never kill a child. She was small and he had always been gentle with her. He couldn't have done the horrible thing this Trista person said he had done. Although she was beginning to wonder if her Poppy remembered that he had a granddaughter at all. He had always liked Finn better. The most scary thing of all, however, was the fact that her daddy seemed to have forgotten her. Didn't he love her anymore? And now it was night time and the little girl should have been tucked into bed and kissed on the forehead by both mommy and daddy before drifting to sleep, safe and sound. And though she was beginning to feel like her hero had forgotten all about her, she tried to call one last time. Daddy. She sobbed through the silence of the hut. Daddy, please. There was no response. The girl became increasingly desperate. Her daddy always came when she cried for him. Where was he? Couldn't he hear her? Didn't he want to take her away from this horrible place? Daddy, she wailed louder this time. Where are you? Crunch. Something had landed on the snow outside. She heard the snuffle of a dragon. Hello, came a voice. Is anyone in there? Daddy, the girl wailed. Marie, the voice cried. My sweet Marie. The door was flung open and a man stomped through, a lamp in his hand illuminating his face. Shaggy brown hair surrounded his face, bright green eyes shined through the dark, a sparkly white scarf seemed to glisten in the lamplight. Was this her daddy? Marie, the man repeated. He held up the lamp so he could see the tiny girl against the wall. His face fell. I am so sorry, my dear. I thought. He sighed sadly and walked over. He looked so much like her daddy. Adriana could see more wrinkles on his face, flecks of grey in his hair, a slender but slightly heavier frame than her father's, and 2 feet. The resemblance was striking and Adriana was half convinced that this man had to be her daddy's long-lost brother or a cousin. He stared at her, a soft compassion in his gaze so much like that of her daddy's. Did Trista take you too? The man asked in a gentle voice. He even sounded like her father, only with a slightly lower, clearer tone. Adriana nodded shakily. I want my daddy, she whimpered. Then I'll not waste any more time, dear. The stranger got out a dagger from his belt and began to cut away at the ropes. As he worked, he muttered to himself so quietly, the girl almost didn't hear. This demon, this villain, this monster. Bullying children is her game, is it? Then let us see what this creature thinks she can do when the wrath of a grown man stands before her. Oh, I think not, came a horrible voice from the entrance of the hut. Adriana couldn't see her very well in the dim lamplight, but she saw the silver glint in Trista's hand. The girl opened her mouth to cry out to her rescuer, but the older woman was too quick for her. She brought down the metal object with a sickening look of glee in her eyes. There was a horrible cry, a splatter of red, and the man fell at the girl's feet. A scream of horror erupted in Adriana's throat as she backed away from the body. The man's blood continued to seep out and slowly grow nearer to where she was standing. Trista looked down at the body with a satisfied smile before looking up at the little girl. Adriana squeaked in terror and tried to back away some more. Oh my dear, Trista simpered. I have no plans to do the same to you. No, you serve a much bigger purpose. Without you, I'd have no leverage. Zebak, however, she nudged the body with her foot, wasn't necessary. I lured him here to finish his story, and now, after such a long time, it's finally over. She reached down and picked up something from beneath the body, raising an eyebrow as she held it close to her face for inspection. Oh, you came prepared. Potent Sanationis is the most powerful healing herb in existence. This will do very nicely. Quite suddenly, Trista leaned forward, her grey eyes flashing and causing Adriana's heart to pound in terror. But if anyone tries to save you again, I'll do exactly the same thing. Wouldn't do to let your daddy die so painfully, would it? Don't he hurt daddy? Adriana whimpered through a tiny hiccup. Well, that's up to you. If he or anyone else as much as touches you, I will kill them. Do you understand me? Trista took a deep breath as if this conversation had exhausted her. And then her eyes flitted to the skirt on Adriana's waist. Those stains certainly won't wash out, she chortled as she took in the bloodstains on the purple cloth. And then her smile widened. Without any warning, she stomped forward and yanked the skirt off the girl's waist. No. Adriana wailed, unable to stop her due to her bindings. Scare tactics are always such good motivators. Trista held up the little skirt so she could see it better. Let's see what your parents think of this. She dropped the skirt into the still-growing puddle of blood and soaked it until its original color was completely obscured. Although I suppose I'll have to find a way to assure them that you're still alive. I'll figure something out on the way down. The elderly woman got out a bit of parchment and quickly wrote out a note before taking the skirt and her changing and heading to the door. She paused for a moment. When I get back, I have a lovely bedtime story for you. It's about an escapologist who met his untimely end and the circumstances that brought him there. But for now, Blaze, be a dear and make sure young Addie doesn't attract the attention of anyone else who may be flying over. By any means necessary. Adriana jumped when the door was slammed in her face. The dim lighting of the lamp Ziba had left still flickered and illuminated the bright red blood still pooling beneath him. Unwittingly, she let out a tiny sob and backed against the wall as far as she could. The Nada, which didn't look very different from her mother's in this lighting, raised its tail and brought it down. Adriana let out a scream as white-hot pain exploded across her face and she would have skidded across the floor had she not been tied up. The little girl kept her mouth shut and desperately tried not to make a single sound. But as the putrid smell of blood and decay began to fill her nostrils, she realized that she would never see her family again. And this crushing reality took away the last remnants of innocence that she had left. There had been so much blood. How her clothes hadn't been as blood-stained as her skirt remained a mystery in her mind. She had spent over a day in Ziba's presence, inhaling the pungent smells of his decaying body. As he rotted, Trista had delightedly told her the story of his days as an escapologist, his marriage to the acrobat, and the death-defying stunt they had attempted. Of the little girl born to them and then stolen by Trista herself. 3.5 years ago, all the reading she had done had caused the stories to slowly fade into her memory and she felt slightly freer to release them. She had, of course, made a few additions to the narrative to make it her own and convince Matilda and her father that she was the one making them up. But they weren't hers, not really. They belonged to the man inside the hut who had lost his life in search of his precious little girl, Marie. For years, Adriana wondered what had happened to the child but she had no way of knowing. It would have been so long ago. She could only pray that the girl had found freedom. And perhaps a loving family who cared enough for her to protect her from that kind of pain again. Unlike Hiccup. Adriana tried to push the thought far from her mind. She wanted to forget that she still doubted him. But it wasn't the sort of thing that could be forgotten. Over the last few years, her trust in her father had waned. She'd even stopped calling him Daddy. Now he was Dad. She didn't even know when that had happened. One day she was his little girl, the next she was grown up. Why was she having these feelings now? Why didn't she trust a man she once believed to be the strongest man in the world? Why did thinking about him make her angry inside? What had he done to deserve her ire? Was it just that he hadn't come or was there more? The girl would have thought about it for a longer time if she hadn't heard a squawk from just in front of her. She opened her eyes and saw Pipsqueak, the family terror, perched on Lily's head. Pipsqueak had a bit of parchment tied to her leg and she patiently allowed the Haddock girl to untie it and open it. Hiccup and Audrey. Finn and I are sick. Mara says I'm going to be fine but we can't get Finn's fever down. A few of our older people have already died, but Binnen is still healthy. Those who died were already in poor health but I'm afraid someone younger will follow. Please come back soon. Astrid. People had died. A horrible feeling of guilt overwhelmed the girl as she reread this section of the note. Sure, they were older and probably didn't have much time left but they were still family members, friends, acquaintances. There would be people in mourning and funerals for her father to conduct. She couldn't waste any more time. Snow was falling thick and fast on the ground before she could make herself move and the dark clouds overhead were beginning to look ominous. She could hear things being shifted inside the hut. It sounded like her father was throwing things around with no real concern for Trista's belongings. Dad, she shakily called. She was sliding off her dragon. Lily lowered her head to make it easier as she slowly placed her foot on the snow-covered ground. The tiny crunch of her boot on icy snow made her jump. She lowered her other foot and clung to her dragon to keep her balance. The piercing cold, the snow on the ground, the hut still standing on the mountain, she was stepping right into her nightmares. She was beginning to feel nauseous and dizzy. Trying to walk forward was like trying to walk on the slipperiest ice. Her head felt precariously perched on her body, which barely held itself up. She could feel her dragon's snout on her back to help her keep her balance. I can do this, she whispered into the freezing air. I can do this. The hut swam in front of her eyes. It was getting closer and closer, her arm extended and her gloved hands pressed against the door. It took a few seconds to find the strength to push it open. It was exactly as she had remembered it. Papers all over the walls and even hanging off the ceiling. Objects that had once belonged to her family strewn everywhere. A corner of the room with ropes that had held her tiny body in place. But unlike her nightmares, now her father was sitting in the middle, going through everything in sight in the hopes that the plant would mysteriously appear. Trista suddenly flashed in the girl's brain, smiling widely and putting the plant in a dark jar on one of the shelves. Adriana's eyes flitted to the jar, which was still untouched. "Addie, what is it?" Hiccup rose from where he was seated when his daughter pointed to a spot above his left shoulder. He turned and saw the small jar. "It's there." He hurried over to the jar and opened it. The plant was dry, but its containment had preserved it fairly well. Just as he pocketed it, he turned and saw Adriana wobbling on the spot. Suddenly knowing what was going to happen next, he rushed forward just as the girl's eyes fluttered closed and she lost consciousness. He caught her as she plummeted to the ground and held her close. "Toothless," he called, his heart racing as he checked to make sure Adriana was still breathing. The night fury burst in just as he sighed in relief at his daughter's steady breaths. Before he mounted his dragon, he put his ear to her chest just to make sure her heartbeat was steady. It was racing but strong. That had to be a good sign, didn't it? His paternal instinct satisfied that his child wasn't in any immediate danger. He was suddenly gripped with fear as he looked outside the open door. There seemed to be a wall of snow descending upon the darkening landscape and he had very little time to act. It was going to be hard enough to fly back to the village, but now he was also carrying a 95-pound girl and attempting to keep her warm, for the second time in the last week. And then he had to guide Lily back as well. There was no time to waste. "All right," Addie Hiccup muttered to her as he carefully mounted Toothless and held her close. "Let's get you out of here." As he and Toothless emerged from the house and took off, Lily following close behind, a gust of wind nearly knocked them off course. Hiccup couldn't see a thing through the blizzard. He was going to have to pray that he knew Burke well enough to direct the dragons to the village. He held Adriana close to his chest while squinting through the snow to try to see where he was going. As he flew, he couldn't help but feel frustration because they could have beaten the blizzard had his daughter found the courage to enter the house earlier. But another part was proud of her for even setting foot in the hut. His little girl was healing. Maybe one day, she would be free from Trista's clutches. One day, but not today. A heavy boom erupted through the great hall, making both healthy and ill inhabitants jump at the sudden noise. The onlookers watched as the wide doors opened with a mighty heave and a tall, thin man with a peg leg strode inside with a small blonde girl in his arms, swathed in a heavy cloak. The man's dark hair was nearly white from the raging blizzard outside, so he was nearly unrecognizable except for the peg leg and the two dragons on his heels. "Hiccup. It's Hiccup. The chief's back." Excited chatter ran through the crowds as Hiccup walked stiffly to the center of the hall carrying Adriana in his arms. Though he kept most of his focus on his daughter, his eyes continuously scanned the rows upon rows of the sick. He tried to make out Astrid and Finn in the masses, but couldn't seem to find them. "Hiccup." Hiccup halted mid-step when Mara hurried toward him some beds nearby. Mara rested a hand on Adriana's forehead and immediately asked, "What happened?" "Long story," Hiccup rasped. "She only passed." "What's wrong with your voice?" Mara interrupted. Hiccup jerked away when she reached for his face to inspect his mouth, and the healer frowned. "Are you coughing?" "I'm fine. The ingredients for the cure are in that satchel on Toothless' saddle. Except these, here." Hiccup took the potent sanationis and the list the bog burglars had given him out of his pocket and placed them in her hands. "Where are Astrid and Finn? Won't you at least let me look at?" "I'm fine, Mara." "Adriana." Mara finished pointedly. Hiccup sighed, jutting out his jaw as he gazed at the ceiling. "She's fine, she only had a hard day. Trust me." "I do trust you until you won't let me do my job." "Mara." Hiccup bit out her name, finally losing patience. "You need to make the cure immediately and I want to see my family." "Now where are they?" Mara sighed and jerked her chin toward the back of the hall. "They're back there. But brace yourself for the other families in the area." Hiccup instantly walked toward the back when Mara turned to pull the satchel off of Toothless' back. The chief nodded toward anyone he made eye contact with, but didn't slow his pace in his search for his wife and son. At last he caught sight of Binnen and Astrid on the other side of the Larson family's pillar. A sharp gasp made Hiccup falter and he jerked at the sight of a blonde teenager leaping from a nearby bench. "Annie." Hiccup exhaled heavily, trying to slow his rapidly beating pulse from the short scare. Eric the Chief paused, taking in the 15-year-old's haggard appearance, red eyes and tear-stained face. Hiccup shook his head to clear it and smiled at him gently. She's okay. Just took a tumble. Is she okay? Eric asked quietly, his voice trembling. Will she be? Hiccup nodded firmly. Yes. She'll be fine, buddy. Don't worry. He noticed Binnen perk from the next area over and he glanced back at Eric. Sorry, I have to go. It's fine, Chief. Eric mumbled. Stay with Finn while you can. As Hiccup walked away, he registered Eric sitting back down on the bench and covering his face with his hands, vaguely wondering what a comment like that meant, until he passed the Larson's pillar, and he nearly dropped his daughter. The Larson family huddled around a makeshift mat, pillow and blankets surrounding it in an apparent attempt to keep the occupant comfortable. Except a thin white sheet had been drawn over the body of the Larson patriarch, Olaf. The air squeezed out of Hiccup's lungs when it registered. His friend, a counselor, a good, wise man, Olaf Larson, was gone. Every job Olaf had and every memory they shared raced through Hiccup's mind as he stared at the unmoving cloth. Lara sat beside the mat with a stiff back, blank expression as she stared down at her husband's body. Gustav held his wife Michaela at the head of the pillow while Magnus and Gregory quietly cried by the feet. Aud and her husband held each other tightly, and Nicholas sat by idly with an angry expression, ignoring all eye contact. Only Eric sat a yard or two away, alone. Hiccup stared in his direction for a bit, his heart aching for the teenager. He, too, had lost his father, but losing him at such a young age, there was no way to understand that kind of pain. The pain of the days that were still to come, the memories that were still to be made now taken far too soon. Coming of age in just 2 years, marriage, children, everything that a young man had to look forward to share with his family, his father looking on with pride, all of it blotted out of the prospective future in an instant. Hiccup couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose his father at such a young age and not share the wonderful things of young adulthood with him. Gustav finally noticed him standing there and Hiccup drank in the grief written on his face. When? Hiccup asked in a raspy whisper. Gustav swallowed thickly, running his hand through Michaela's hair for a moment. Half an hour ago. Hiccup closed his eyes and pressed his lips together, a wave of grief washing over him. They'd gotten back just late. Too late. Staring at his only boot, he whispered, I'm sorry. He didn't wait for any response from the Larsons. He turned and walked toward his family, already feeling his shoulders tighten with grief and tension. His prosthetic echoed in the corner and Binnen stood from his seat, welcoming him into their secluded area with a warm hand on his shoulder. Fear ignited in Hiccup's chest at the sight of his Astrid hunched over the prone form of their son, pale, sweaty and weak. Astrid ran her fingers through Finn's hair until the sound of Hiccup's prosthetic announced his arrival. She looked up, weary but alert, and gasped at the sight of Adriana in Hiccup's arms. Adri. Astrid jumped to her feet, stumbling a bit and rushing to them. What happened? What's wrong? Hey, Hiccup eased her back. I think she's okay. She just had an accident, but I think she'll be okay. Here Hiccup spread a few blankets out with the toe of his boot and carefully eased Adriana down. Binnen wordlessly placed a pillow beneath her head and tucked her in. Hiccup thanked him with a smile and stood again to speak to Astrid. His words were cut off by her arms tightening around his neck and holding on tight, her own labored breathing sounding in his ear. I was so scared you wouldn't get back in time, Astrid whispered. Hiccup buried his face in her shoulder, his eyes not leaving his son's face. He wanted to say something encouraging but couldn't think of anything. He knew he couldn't wish to save everyone but... I didn't. Astrid returned to her normal height and gazed up at him with confused eyes. Olaf. Hiccup sighed. We were so close. It's not your fault, Hiccup. Astrid whispered, running her fingers across the worn leather straps on his chest. They tried everything they could and he just couldn't hold on. His body was too weak. Hiccup sighed and nodded, turning out of her arms and walking to Finn's cot. Binnen had seated himself at the foot of Finn's bed to give them room by his head. Hiccup patted his shoulder gently as he sat down, then got a good look at Finn's condition. The chief rested a palm on Finn's forehead and nearly recoiled at the heat radiating off his boy's face. Hiccup opened his mouth to speak but no words came out. He glanced at Astrid and Binnen looking on sadly as he placed his other hand on the top of Finn's head. "He's burning up." Astrid nodded, swallowing thickly. If he'd gotten sick like most people, he'd probably be able to fight it easier. But he worked himself so hard. She stopped, biting her lip to keep her composure. Binnen took her place. "You should have seen him, Hiccup. He put up such a fight for these people, worked himself to the bone until he could work no more. Literally." The elderly man, patting the boy's knee sadly. "Of course we tried to prevent this from happening, but stubborn as he is." Hiccup nodded, noting the sweat accumulating at the base of Finn's neck, making his hair look darker than it actually was. Pale skin that made his freckles stand out even more, short, ragged breathing that made him sound older and frailer than he was. Desperation welled in Hiccup's chest and he forced himself to remain calm. If Astrid and Binnen were holding on after being here all this time, he wouldn't lose it in the first 10 minutes. But that didn't stop him from begging the gods for mercy. They must have been listening, for Mara walked to their group in the next few minutes with a steaming cup of the cure. It smelled terrible and everyone instinctively leaned away from it, but Mara quickly readied the siphon to pour it down Finn's throat. She quickly blew on the steaming mug so she wouldn't burn the poor boy's mouth and throat. Hiccup cleared his throat. "Not that I don't want Finn to have it yet, but is there anyone else that needs it before him?" Astrid gaped at him like he was crazy. Mara smiled understandingly. "Do you really think I'm the only one working right now? A few volunteers have started taking the cure to others who need it. But I'd already resolved in my mind that Finn would be one of the first. That being said..." Mara tilted Finn's head on her knees, placed the siphon in his mouth and carefully began to pour it. Astrid and Binnen sighed in relief when Finn swallowed all of it without problems. Hiccup glanced at them in surprise and Mara took the opportunity to explain, he wasn't too keen on drinking his tea or water this morning. Hiccup breathed a small snort. "Stubborn boy." He saw Binnen smile from the corner of his eye. Toothless waddled in behind Mara and crooned a greeting. He sniffed Finn's slack face, shaking his head at the remaining smell of the cure before realizing the sickness deep inside his boy's body. Moaning sadly, Toothless flopped on his belly and scooted closer until his black nose snuggled against Finn's shoulder. Astrid reached over and scratched one of his head plates lovingly. "If anything changes, let me know." Mara stood with a small smile and hurried back to the cooking area where the cure was being kept. Astrid sagged against Hiccup and sighed. "So, what happened with Adri?" Hiccup frowned, turning his body to both include Binnen and get more comfortable. "The last item on the list, it was a plant. The only place it is grown is several hundred miles from here, and we very well couldn't go that far to get it. Addie, she knew it was on the list the whole trip and didn't say anything to me about it. When she said the list was finished and we could go home, I looked at it and saw the last item. But..." Hiccup shook his head in frustration. Astrid and Binnen waited patiently for him to continue. "She said we couldn't obviously go that far to get it, but the way she was acting, I knew she was hiding something. I just knew it. So eventually I got it out of her." Hiccup paused again, not wanting to speak the words on his mind next. At least his voice was still hoarse so he didn't have to worry about lowering his voice as much. "Trista." Astrid immediately tensed beside him. She had some, in her hut. And Addie remembered it, the whole time. How would she know the name? Hiccup closed his eyes and licked his lips. Then he looked straight into his wife's eyes. "Do you remember how, we always thought that we didn't know everything about what had happened? How little things would set her off? Things that didn't seem to make sense." Astrid nodded, memories resurfacing that she'd forbidden from her mind long ago. "There was a man. I think he heard her crying for help." Hiccup gazed at Binnen sadly for a moment. "I don't know what happened, but I think maybe he tried to rescue her. Trista murdered him right in front of Addie. His name was Zebak. And he was an escapologist." Astrid gasped. "Wait, that's why. Why she got upset with that book." Astrid sighed, resting a hand to her forehead, and she gazed at her resting daughter a few feet away. "Oh, Adri. The things that happened in that wretched place. Hiccup shook his head, rage building in his chest again. Things that we never even dreamed of, they happened. It wasn't just the abuse, emotional and physical. It wasn't just the being tied up and having a dragon several times her size beat her down when her body was so tiny that she could have shattered. No. Trista destroyed every bit of innocence she had down to the very root. All Addie has ever known is fear, and that is what has haunted her day in and day out, and I didn't know enough to help her. Astrid held Hiccup's arm in her hands. You couldn't have known, we never went in the hut. Hiccup scoffed, looking at his sleeping son. How things could be different now if we had. How? What could have changed? We could have addressed it. I don't know how that could have changed anything, Hiccup. Astrid sighed. I'm not saying it wouldn't be worth it. But I don't know. That's the point. Hiccup said through gritted teeth. Now we'll never know. So why is she unconscious? Astrid asked, staring at the still form of her daughter lying on the blankets. When we landed, she wouldn't get off her dragon. I couldn't get her to budge, not even when I told her there was a storm coming. Hiccup leaned his head against Astrid's with a deep frown. She eventually came into the doorway and pointed out what jar the plant was in. I grabbed it, and in the short time it took me to do that, she blacked out. I think the stress just got to her. I don't blame her, she was shaking and terrified to go near the hut, let alone inside. But she cost us some time. I knew the storm was coming and there was too much time wasted in that hut. By then it was too late to beat it back. Astrid's eyes flitted to the Larsens. So Olaf. We couldn't have known. Hiccup's lip wobbled for a moment before he clenched his jaw to remain composed. He shut his eyes and a tear rolled down his cheek, but he pressed through his thoughts. But we might have gotten back before it happened. Astrid gently wiped the tear away with the back of her hand. You didn't get my note. I didn't. If it was about what was happening here. I don't know, maybe Addie did and that's why she came in. Hiccup looked down at his daughter, his vision blurred by still more tears trying to force themselves out. Finn jerked in his sleep with a sharp inhale, making the trio sit forward to check on him. Unfortunately, the teenager remained asleep and the adults were distracted long enough to miss the 15-year-old boy scramble from a nearby bench and stalk to the door with quick steps. Binnen sat back in his seat and clasped his fingers across his stomach. Don't worry. That medicine will help him. He'll be all right. Hiccup sighed, wiping his son's sweaty bangs off his forehead. His fever's so high, if something happens to him, Hiccup shook his head, willing himself to stay calm. I'll never forgive myself for not coming home sooner. Binnen reached an arm over Astrid's back and gently squeezed Hiccup's shoulder. Don't blame yourself. You did everything you could. All that's left to do is wait. Chapter 15, Useless. Chapter text. Perhaps it had been wishful thinking to assume that everyone would immediately be healthy a few minutes after receiving the cure. Those who were recovering seemed to have been cured within minutes while others didn't show any signs of improvement. Within an hour, Tarin, Svala, and a few other younger people were being examined by Mara to see if they could go home. Those related to the people who were recovering seemed to be breathing collective sighs of relief. Tough Nut remained near Svala's mat. He was supposed to pack up the few things they had brought, but his mind was most understandably elsewhere. The disease had taken some of the most beloved elderly people on Berk, including the healer before Mara. Seeing Tasha's body being carried out had brought back childhood memories of broken bones and illnesses for which he and Rough Nut had received treatment. Even the lectures she would deliver as she set their bones and bandaged their cuts still rang in his ears. She had even delivered them years ago. That thought seemed to put a knife through his heart as his eyes focused on the bloodstain still tainting the stone floor. Mara had delivered his and Svala's little son. The silence that followed his birth had been the most agonizing thing Tough Nut had ever heard. He never knew the echoing silence could be so gut-wrenching. Without even realizing he was doing it, he began to trace the outlines of stained stone. They were going to name their baby Devin. He felt a hand on his shoulder and started. Rough Nut stood above him, a sorrowful expression on her face. Tough Nut knew she had been home with the kids who were still healthy, but he supposed, now that the cure was distributed, it was safe for her to come in. He slowly stood up and faced her, his eyes unable to meet hers. "I'm almost done here," he said in a low voice. Rough Nut acted like she hadn't heard him. Her arms brought him in for a hug and held him tight. He put his head on her shoulder and sniffled, trying his best to keep it together. "Next time," Rough Nut whispered. "I promise." "Yeah." Tough Nut sighed deeply as a tear ran down his face. "Next time." As Rough Nut and Tough Nut embraced, Snotlout and Heather blankly watched Mara examining those who recovered the fastest. Inga remained unconscious, moving only to shift positions. They kept a close eye on her, but, thankfully, she had no other episodes. Heather rested her head on her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes. "She'll be okay," she breathed. "She's a Jorgensen. She'll pull through." Snotlout sighed deeply as he allowed his wife to lean on him. They were empty words. They both knew it. Heather coped with difficult situations by talking about how much better things would get. Sometimes she was right, such as when there had been complications with the twins but they had been born healthy anyway. Other times, however, she was wrong. It was what she did when she received word from home that, in the midst of dry season, there had been an enormous raging fire and her parents had perished trying to escape. She said it had to have been a mistake. Her parents couldn't have died so suddenly. And yet Kale still came on the next ship. He still sulked around and lashed out at everyone. Snotlout remembered holding her as the reality of what had happened sank in and she had cried for hours. The words never did any good. So why would this be any different? Their daughter was a strong girl, that much was true. But he had seen the wound on her head. The odds of her waking up waned the longer she remained unconscious. Every moment, he tried to emotionally prepare himself for the worst, but the idea of his baby girl dying in his arms made him want to cry. And he wasn't going to cry again. The Jorgensen women had made his life so much sweeter by their very presence, so it was his job to stay strong for them. The very familiar step thunk of Hiccup's walk alerted the Jorgensens to his presence. Snotlout looked up at him and immediately looked back down, his heart constricting uncomfortably. For some reason, though he wasn't entirely certain why, he felt some of the worst guilt he'd ever had in his life. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Hiccup lower himself to his knees to get a better look at Inga. "Astrid told me what happened," he said quietly, as if raising his voice would wake the sleeping girl. "I am so sorry." The reason for the guilt suddenly hit Snotlout and he felt like someone had run his heart through with a spear. He exhaled in a sudden sigh. "I know what you're thinking," he mumbled. "I'm sorry. Forever implying that Anna wasn't important enough to save." Snotlout. "No, you were right. I should have supported you when you needed it. I know it was almost a decade ago, but I'm so sorry." Snotlout brushed a few strands of hair out of his daughter's face. "I understand now. The uncertainty, the fear, gods, I'm so sorry." "Sure." Hiccup patted Snotlout's hand. "Don't. I didn't come here to rub it in your face. I would never do that." "I know." Snotlout held his daughter closer, resting his forehead against hers. "But it had to be said. Let me know if you need anything." Hiccup rasped, looking sadly at the Jorgensen girl. "Anything at all." "Okay. Thanks." Snotlout muttered. Hiccup stood up and looked around, watching people removing the dead, others taking the cure, and still others gathered around those who had not yet recovered. As his gaze fixed on the Larsens, he saw Gustav's youngest son crying on Michaela's shoulder. Eric was sitting in the back, staring blankly at the wall. As he watched, Magnus tried to engage the boy in conversation, but he didn't respond. His only movements were to wipe tears off of his face with the back of his hand. Hiccup thought about going over and trying to get through to him, but decided against it. If Eric wasn't responding to his own family, there wasn't much the chief could do. In that moment, as he continued to scan the crowd, Hiccup had never felt more useless. It wasn't that he regretted leaving to get the cure, far from it, but he didn't feel like he could provide any words of comfort to those who had suffered a loss. He didn't even know most of the people who had died. Aside from Olaf and Tasha, he'd only known the others who had died by sight. Most had been friends with his grandfather, for Thor's sake. What was he supposed to do? What was he supposed to say at all of the funerals? Did he even have to say anything? He suddenly had so many families to talk to, arrangements to make, people to comfort, it was overwhelming. No one approached him as he stood in the center of the hall, so he decided to go back to his family and help Astrid care for Finn. His wife had recovered quite a bit in the hour since she had received the cure. Their son, on the other hand, was still feverish, and no amount of cool cloths on his head seemed to be doing any good. "Hey." Astrid kissed his cheek as he sat down next to her. "How are the Jorgensens?" "Stressed. Scared." Hiccup sighed deeply. "Not that I blame them. Gods, I hope Inga will be okay. She has a good chance," Binnen said as he wiped some sweat off of Finn's eyelids. "She's strong and she's held it together so far. I think it's only a matter of time." Hiccup opened his mouth to reply when a small groan emanated from a nearby mat. Adriana's eyes fluttered open and stared around the room. "Dad." Hiccup crawled over to her and helped her sit up. "I'm here, Addie. You're in the Great Hall. Mara says you're fine, just had a little spill." Adriana shook off his hands and gave him an almost exasperated look. "I remember what happened." "Good. Listen. I have to tell you something." Hiccup resisted the urge to brush her bangs out of her eyes. She didn't seem to want physical affection right now. "We came back in time to save a lot of people, Addie. I want you to remember that." "But..." He audibly swallowed before continuing. "Olaf Larsson died before we got back." His daughter's eyes widened at this news. "Eric's dad?" Hiccup nodded, his breathing shaky as he tried to hold back the waves of emotion threatening to burst from him. "They did the best they could. But he couldn't hold on any longer." Adriana's lip trembled and tears spilled down her face. "Oh, no," she sniffled loudly. "Eric." Hiccup took a breath and was about to reply when he saw movements out of the corner of his eye. Astrid leaned forward and rested her hand against Finn's forehead. She gasped lightly and a small smile formed on her face. "His fever broke. His fever broke." Hiccup quickly joined her and rested a palm on his son's sweaty face. Finn hummed in his sleep, stirring slightly but not waking. The chief sighed in relief and smiled wide at Binnen, who seemed to shine brightly with happiness. "He's going to be okay. He's going to be fine." It was all the father could do to keep his joy capped. Astrid, however, rested her forehead against her son's, thankful tears rolling down her face. Adriana smiled weakly at her brother's apparent healing before searching the crowd with her eyes. She finally spotted Eric across the hall, staring at nothing. The girl hopped to her feet and raced over, running into several people on the way and barely stopping long enough to mumble apologies. Eric didn't look up to acknowledge that he had heard her. He continued to stare at the wall, tears falling down his face. The girl suddenly stopped mid-run, which nearly caused her to trip. Something about this was off. Not quite right. This was Eric, her best friend, so what was wrong? Then it hit her. He was crying. In the last decade of friendship, Eric had been her rock. When she needed a good cry, he was there with a handkerchief and a hug. But, in all those years, Adriana couldn't think of a single time in which he was the one crying. She'd seen him excited, anxious, nervous, angry, even sad, but he had never cried. Not in front of her, anyway. How had she never noticed? What kind of a friend was she to let herself cry all over him when she never once returned the favor? Well, today was as good a day as any to start doing for him what he had always done for her. "Eric," she mumbled, inching forward and opening her arms the tiniest bit so she could hug him if he needed it. "I'm so sorry about what happened. Everything will be okay." Eric turned his puffy eyes to face her and the oddest expression crossed his face. Almost scathing. The girl took a step back, suddenly alarmed. "You," he nearly spat, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and grief. Adriana blinked in surprise but still made a poor attempt at smiling. "I'm here now. Everything will be okay." "Okay." Eric shouted very suddenly, jumping to his feet and getting right in Adriana's face. "Who are you to tell me whether anything will ever be okay again? Adriana stumbled back so quickly she tripped and bumped into a nearby bench. The wood screeched in the sudden silence of the hall, and she suddenly became aware of dozens of eyes focused on her. But she kept her focus on her hurting friend. What am I supposed to? My father is dead. Adriana nearly gasped at the frankness in his voice. Eric clenched his jaw and plowed through his thoughts. He was dying all week. Fevers, wet, heaving coughs, cold sweats, couldn't keep food or water down, and more. Nothing Mara could do could help him. I'd put my faith and trust in you, and when it happened I thought maybe you just couldn't get back in time. There was nothing to be done. Eric. Is it true then? You sat up there with the last ingredient in your grasp and you couldn't just get a grip for 2 minutes to bring it? Who told you that? Adriana breathed, her face growing hot. My father is dead because of you and your weakness. You could have gotten back in time. He died half an hour before you got back. Hiccup emerged from the crowd a moment later with his hand already held out in a placating manner. Eric. Eric whipped his gaze to the chief and his body seemed to shake with fury. Hey, you need to calm down. Why didn't you try harder? Force her to do what was needed instead of babying her, like you always do. A few women gasped nearby as Hiccup blanched. Never had anyone heard the boy speak out so boldly, let alone against his close friend. Don't talk to me. He turned back to Adriana with a scathing look. As for you, I don't want anything more to do with you. You're a selfish brat that won't stop putting herself before everything in life, even when some things are more important. Eric Hiccup tensed. My father's name is on your ledger, Adriana. As are some others here, I'm sure. Nothing you can say or do, no hugs or letting me cry on your shoulder will change the fact that you've taken my father from me. Eric's lip trembled and he barely managed to keep composure. Get away from me, Adriana. Don't talk to me. Don't come over. Don't even look at me. We're done. Before Adriana had time to react, he grabbed a book off the table before stomping over and shoving it into her arms. He then turned on his heel and walked out of the hall without another word. Hiccup stared at the door for several seconds, his mouth slightly agape. Eric's words still echoed in his ears. A part of him was almost convinced he'd imagined this. The Eric Larson he knew never acted this way. Never said such horrible things to his daughter. Then again, under the circumstances he couldn't be expected to act normal. He was grieving, he didn't mean all of those things, and of course he would forgive Addie. Addie. He looked over at his little girl and his heart sank. Her hands clutched the book, her head had fallen so that her forehead nearly rested on it, and her shoulders were shaking. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Were his daughter a tiny child, he would have immediately gotten on his knees and scooped her up into his arms, holding her close until she couldn't cry any longer. But his little girl wasn't a little girl anymore. She needed comfort, but not in a coddling way. She was a young lady now, so that's how he would treat her. Gently, lovingly. He would be her rock like he should be, even when her best friend failed her. Almost instinctively, his hand reached out and slowly rested on her shoulder. She didn't move. Her breathing came in short gasps just as several of her tears slowly fell down the back of the book. Addie. Just give him time. He'll come back around, you'll see. Hiccup relaxed a bit when the crowd began to murmur amongst themselves. Thankfully the attention began to draw away from them. Everything will be okay. No, it won't. Adriana muttered in a hollow voice. Yes, it will, you'll see. These things happen, and gods know I fell apart for a while after my dad died. And he's a lot younger. Losing a parent is a terrible thing. Adriana stared down at his prosthetic and tuned out his words. For some reason, she didn't want to hear it. The more he talked, the more his words seemed to take a skewed, twisted form to mean the opposite of what he meant. Everything would be okay. Things hadn't been okay in years. Promises to always be there. He was never there when he was needed the most. And these things happen because it's a part of life. These things, these tragedies all seemed to be a part of her life. And it just kept getting worse by the day. Adriana ground her teeth together as she felt her blood boil. She tried to find some other source that fueled her anger, but nothing would suffice. There was only one man responsible for all of her life's struggles, her nightmares, feeling abandoned, never being accepted, the loss of Eric's father, the loss of the one and only friend that she ever had. It was his fault. And nothing she could think, say, or do would convince her stubborn mind otherwise. Your fault. Adriana mumbled stiffly, the words jerky in her mouth. Hiccup paused mid-sentence, thrown off from his tangent and confused for a moment before recovering. One more time, Addie. I didn't catch. This is your fault. Something hot and thick rushed through Adriana's body and she suddenly felt bold, dangerous even. Unstoppable. She snapped her gaze up to him and his green eyes widened in shock. Addie, baby. Don't call me that. Adriana roared and Hiccup jerked backwards as if he'd been hit. When had she suddenly gotten such a strong voice? The Great Hall continued on its course, the people determined to ignore the second round of drama, but no one could ignore what the young Haddock girl shouted next. Why would you tell me that everything is going to be okay? Why would you make me promises that you can't keep? Adriana shouted at her father, who stared down at her with wide eyes. Hiccup glanced away for a moment, searching for Astrid for backup. Screaming matches were Finn's area of expertise, not Adriana's. He honestly didn't know what to do. Addie, please calm. When have you ever kept a promise? How many times have I held up on my end of something and you never give back? And now when everything falls apart with the only friend I have ever had, you have the audacity to tell me that everything will be okay. That I need to just give Eric time and he'll come back. Addie, please stop yelling. Hiccup pleaded. No. I won't. Because for once in my life I'm accepting what everyone has ever said to be true, and I want every single person to hear it. Adriana marched forward and jabbed her finger into Hiccup's chest, making him back up like it was a lethal weapon. You are a liar and a useless coward. Addie. Can't keep a single promise that you make me. Please stop. Hiccup's back hit a pillar, trapped between stone and his angry child. I wish I'd never believed in you. Hell, I wish maybe I would have just died in that hut at Trista's hand, it would have saved me a whole lot of pain and struggle, wouldn't it? People were gasping now as Astrid and Binnen emerged from the crowd nearby. Astrid walked forward quickly, still shoving people aside. Adriana, stop this. My life is a living hell because you didn't show up and I've had to pick up my own pieces ever since. And I'm tired of waiting for you to act like you care. Hiccup's throat bobbed as she talked, trying desperately to hold himself together. Adriana continued angrily, everything you have ever said to me is useless and void, and I won't be wasting another second with you. So I hope you're happy, Dad, because you won't be fixing this. There's nothing left for you to break and you couldn't fix it if you tried. So just go away. Adriana raised her arm and slammed the book down at Hiccup's feet, ripped the flower she had been wearing out of her hair, and turned in time to dodge Astrid's grabbing hand, and stalked out of the great hall with a tailless face and her head held high like it never had been before. Hiccup watched Adriana walk out until she disappeared from view. His throat hurt no matter how many times she swallowed. His Adam's apple felt like it had been punched in. His stomach felt like he'd drunk a jug of Yarnog. He looked away from the place his daughter last stood, trying to find some place to look to regain composure. Eyes everywhere. Most people looked away in sadness, resuming their tasks, but he still felt exposed to everyone's stare. Even staring at his one boot and prosthetic was unsettling because there it lay. The book full of stories about the spaceman and his friends that he shared with his baby girl since she was 10 years old and snuggling up next to him by the fire, singing songs, and begging for just one more chapter before bedtime. And next to it, one of the hair flowers he'd so carefully made, the little jewels scattered on the ground beneath the book and several detached petals still slowly drifting downward. The thought threatened to tumble him over the edge and he tensed. Should he chase after her like he always did? Should he walk away? Try to help people around him like a chief should do? Bury himself in his work to hide grief and pain like his father always did? What should he do? Binnen became his hero right then when he bent down and picked up the book with gentle fingers, brushed off the dirt, and steered Hiccup away from unwanted eyes back toward Finn's mat where he still lay asleep. Every step felt heavy and guilt and sadness washed over his soul. He almost wished he would get sick instead of deal with this stabbing pain in his gut. He glanced at Finn as he walked by, hoping to use his son's progression back to health to ground himself. But another wave of misery washed over him at the realization that if they'd come any later, Finn could be gone too. He allowed Finn to go on the trip to visit the bogs. He asked Olaf to come even though the risks with his wheelchair were high anyway. The sickness coming to Berk was his fault. Adriana was right. This entire thing was his fault. Hiccup stood against the pillar facing the back wall where he wouldn't be seen and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook in silent pain, still trying to hold himself together. Wordlessly, Benen wrapped his arms around his friend in a comforting hug and sadly listened to Hiccup's choppy breathing. After nearly a minute, Hiccup pulled the elderly man closer. Benen wished he could say something comforting that could ease the man's pain. Everything would be okay, this is just a hard phase, she didn't mean it. But everything wouldn't necessarily just be okay. This was a hard phase, and there was no reason to state the obvious. And worst of all, Benen deeply feared that Adriana did mean it. A person can only be pushed so far until they snap. Benen had learned that over the years as a slave, whether he learned from experience or careful observation. But one way or another, he saw it time and time again, every person has his or her limits. Adriana was clearly at hers, there would be no dumbing down her pains and sorrows anymore. And Hiccup, well, there was only so much he could do for his grieving and recovering village, but his family on top of it. That much stress would drive anyone mad. But to be publicly hated and criticized and cut so deeply by someone so fiercely important. Benen was a wise man. But every wise man knows that sometimes no wisdom in the world can fix things. Hiccup lifted his head and wiped his face with the back of his hand. He was muttering unintelligibly, but Benen definitely heard the words, can't lose it in the utterances. Hiccup, don't hold it in. It's okay to let it out, no one will judge you after witnessing that. Benen said quietly. Hiccup gently shook his head. I see, can't he break down? Not now. The last thing you need right now is emotional repression. Trust me on this. Benen reached into his pocket and brought out a handkerchief, which he handed to his friend. Hiccup caught sight of Astrid slowly walking toward them, carefully holding the remnants of the flower in her hands. What could I have done that day, those days to have come sooner? Astrid's face fell in empathy and Hiccup continued, I could have done better, tried hard. No. Astrid interrupted, gently pulling him closer to her but still including Benen. You did everything you could to find her that day. Those days. Don't focus on those what-ifs. Trista destroyed her trust in us, and it does make sense. It's no less painful, but we can't blame Adri. But neither should you tear yourself down for it. Benen agreed, resting a hand on Hiccup's shoulder when he sniffed and wiped at his face again. You did everything you could. One day she will see that and she will see how much you do love her. And if she doesn't? Hiccup asked shakily. What if she decides that she doesn't need me anymore and leaves? Never comes back? You're her father. Benen replied quietly. You will do whatever is necessary to protect her. Even if it's from herself. It's not just her though. Hiccup wiped his eyes again, the handkerchief becoming more damp in his hands. The whole village, all those people who died because we brought that disease back from the bogs. Hiccup. Astrid reached out and took his face in her hands, waiting for him to look her in the eye. We can't prevent what we can't predict. You know that as well as I do. And that goes for anything that's happened. Benen added. You couldn't possibly have known about Trista or this disease. Hiccup sighed heavily, glancing at the far corner of the hall. Where am I supposed to start? I mean, I feel like I need to try to talk to Addie, though my rational side says to give her space. He paused to clear his throat, still raspy from his cold. But I feel like the village needs me more. Not more, I don't know about more, but more I don't know, there's just too much to do. I've never felt so useless. You're not, came a quiet voice to the right of the group. Snotlout stood beside them, his eyes still averting Hiccups. Useless, I mean. You're a great dad and a great chief. Snotlout, this is not the time nor the place for flattery. Astrid said carefully, unsure of her old friend's intentions for barging into their conversation. I agree. Snotlout stepped up and finally looked Hiccup in the eye. Which is why what I'm about to say is completely honest. He paused for a moment before continuing. You're one of the bravest men I've ever known. Hiccup stared at Snotlout for several seconds before speaking. What? Hiccup, you have saved our village on countless occasions and that's why everyone else considers you a hero. But that's not why I do. Snotlout took a deep breath. You're a hero because you don't let anything take you down. When Trista took Anna, you searched for her tirelessly, relentlessly, and you got her back. When Dager threatened your family, you went against everything you ever believed in and killed him. That's why I was so angry when you went off the deep end 6.5 years ago. Snotlout. No, let me finish. You need to hear this. Snotlout's voice became firmer, more confident. Not long ago, I might have thought that Anna had a point, that you were showing up too late and partially to blame for what happened. But he looked over at his unconscious daughter still lying on the mat near the fireplace. I couldn't protect Inga from what happened. I couldn't have known she was going to get hurt. And that thought haunts me every second. I can't eat, I can't sleep. I know what you went through. And I know for certain that what happened to Anna wasn't your fault. And that you're strong enough to keep on going, even if your daughter never wants to speak to you again. Heck, she's going to forgive you because you're going to be every bit as relentless as you were when she was kidnapped. At least. Snotlout gave him a weak smile. That's what the Hiccup I know would do. There was a long pause. Hiccup, Astrid, and Benen were looking at the burly Viking with equal expressions of surprise. It was rare for Snotlout to be this candid. Even rarer for him to pay Hiccup a compliment. Snotlout, however, seemed to be mulling something over for several seconds. He looked away and furrowed his brow before making eye contact again. And I may have blamed you for a few other things. Snotlout finally averted his gaze. They weren't your fault either. I'm sorry. Thank you. Hiccup sniffled and nodded to his friend. That helped. Snotlout patted Hiccup on the shoulder. Good, because if you repeat anything I just said, I'll deny it. And he's back. Astrid muttered under her breath. Their friend narrowed his eyes at Astrid for a second before heading over to get some drinking water for his wife. Hiccup took a deep breath and wiped his eyes again. He's right, he mumbled. I can't give up. Not on her or Finn or the village. He slowly scanned the hall with his eyes before making a decision. I can't do everything myself. But I can do my share. Right now, I'm going to help some of these people pack up. It's small but... He sighed. It's something. That's all you need to do. Astrid kissed his still damp cheek. Something. Chapter 16, Coming Back Around. Chapter text. Finn had always been an active boy. Ever since the day he took his first steps, he was running all over the village like he owned the place, getting into things and causing all sorts of mischief. This hadn't changed when he began to grow into his teenage years, except now he had an affinity for wrestling with the boys his age, hunting trips with Helga, and other sorts of activities that taxed him physically. He loved it, pushing his limits to see how far he could go, feeling the muscles in his arms shake with strain, and feeling the sweat accumulate on his brow during hard work. Those were the times that he truly felt like a man, despite his obvious teenage features. Naturally, after every long and hard day, he'd crash in his bed, completely exhausted, ready the next morning to spring out of bed at the crack of dawn to begin a new day. Never before had Finn experienced so much exhaustion. And never before had he come to the frank conclusion in his mind that he was most certainly not ready to spring out of bed, and he was definitely not ready to begin a new day. The sun would have to rise without him today. Whatever day it was. His mind felt foggy, his thoughts sluggish. His entire body felt heavy and weak, like he'd had to carry a whole deer across the entire island by himself. It was a struggle to recall what he did last. He remembered hunting for deer with Helga and fish. No, he had to fix a fishing net or something, right? With a short exhale, Finn finally opened his eyes to find himself lying on his back in the great hall. A quick, concerned glance to his left revealed the hall mostly empty beyond nearby tables and benches. Confusion stunned him as he again tried to remember the last thing that happened, when a big, warm hand rested on his forehead. Finn slightly jumped at the touch and turned his head to the right but relaxed when he saw who it was. "Hey buddy," Hiccup whispered with a soft smile. "It's okay, you're all right now." Finn frowned. All right. He felt sluggish but he didn't feel terrible. What did he mean? Was. The teenager started and cleared his throat, shocked at how thin and weak it sounded. "What's wrong? What happened?" Hiccup adjusted his blankets carefully, so as to not disturb Astrid sleeping with her head in his lap. Finn took note of Benin sleeping against a few propped-up pillows at the next pillar as his father replied. "You passed out, worked yourself too hard while you were sick." "Oh." Finn's brow furrowed. "Wait, but I wasn't sick. Mara thinks you worked so hard and didn't get a proper amount of rest that your immune system was working overtime. Basically, you crashed." Hiccup gave his son a stern eye for a moment. "I know I said to help your mother and the village, but I didn't mean work yourself to the bone. Dad, there was too much to do. I couldn't waste time." Hiccup nodded. "I understand. A chief's work is never done. There's always going to be something to do, someone to help. But that doesn't mean you don't take time for yourself. Even if it means stepping outside for 5 minutes of fresh air, it's necessary. And that's why you take random flights with Toothless now and then." "Yes," Hiccup affirmed, "it's our little bit of time to just relax and breathe without being badgered. It's practically medicinal." Finn snorted and rubbed his angry throat with his fingertips. Hiccup returned a moment later with a small cup of water, which Finn drank gratefully. He wiped his lips with his sleeve before settling back into his pillow. "So, how long was I out then?" "Oh." Hiccup paused in thought. "About a day and a half, almost 2. 2 days?" Finn asked incredulously. "Gods, that explains why I feel so sluggish. I haven't done anything." "You're sluggish because your body is trying to get rid of the sickness and catch up on rest," Hiccup replied in a careful voice. "Finn, buddy." Finn raised an eyebrow when his father stopped, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't sad and it wasn't happy, but almost a mix between the two. He felt like he was being scrutinized and weighed like a sack of grain to be bought. "What?" A corner of Hiccup's mouth lifted a bit. "I want you to listen to me carefully, okay? First off, I want to apologize that you had to work so hard." "Dad, I wanted to." "I had to," Finn argued. "No, I know, Finn." Hiccup held out a hand in a placating manner. "I'm not saying that it wasn't necessary. But you're only 13. That's a lot of responsibility for a young man to take on. But that leads to my second point." The Haddock patriarch smiled wide for a moment before continuing, "I am so proud of you, for everything that you did for our people. The father inside me cringes at the thought of you literally passing out in exhaustion from everything that you had to do, but he can't help but swell with pride at how hard you worked for your people. You saw what needed to be done and you didn't give up or stop. It's not easy for someone with little experience to handle something so stressful, let alone for that long. Words can't express how proud you made me this week, Finn. And I don't want you to ever forget it." Finn stared at his father, speechless. He didn't know what to say or do in response. Finally, he opted to close his mouth and shrug with a timid, "Thanks, Dad." Hiccup ruffled his son's hair playfully. "No, thank you. I heard several good things." Finn smiled, turning his eyes to the sleeping forms of his mother and Benin. He turned a bit to see Toothless and Stormfly sleeping nearby. But in a sudden burst of curiosity, he asked, "Where's Anna?" Hiccup's face fell instantly and Finn suddenly felt guilty, like he reopened a fresh wound. His father looked across the great hall with a deep sadness in his eyes that the teen hadn't seen in a long time. She's not dead, is she?" Finn quietly asked and his father jerked. "No. No. She's. Hiccup swallowed, playing with a strap on his leather jacket. "She's at home." "What happened?" Finn asked through a yawn, genuinely curious to know. Hiccup smiled weakly and shook his head. "Don't worry about it right now. Your mother and I will fill you in tomorrow when you're more awake." Finn felt himself drooping and scowled through another yawn. "I don't wanna, sleep more." "Don't fight it. You'll be up and at 'em again in no time if you just let it happen. Hiccup brushed his son's bangs off his forehead gently as Finn closed his eyes. Love ya, Dad. Finn mumbled just before dropping off into a peaceful sleep. With a thankful smile, the Haddock father whispered, I love you too, buddy. Hiccup rested his hand on Astrid's back gently and adjusted himself against Toothless to sit more comfortably. Thoughts of his daughter flooded his mind again and another wave of grief came over him. He shook his head and closed his eyes. Tomorrow was another day, and sometimes even the chief needs to rest. Finn awoke the next morning feeling more rested than he had the night before. He stretched long and hard enough to emit an embarrassing squeak. He cleared his throat to cover it but still heard a soft chuckle beside him. He turned at the familiar sound and brightened instantly at Binnen sitting beside him. Good morning, sunshine. Binnen grinned widely, a rough palm already on the boy's forehead to check his temperature. Binnen Finn smiled, for some reason feeling a tad emotional. He could see the joy in his best friend's eyes at seeing him awake and talking, which spoke volumes. He must have been really sick if Binnen was this overjoyed. You're looking much better than you were last night. Binnen beamed. I don't want to seem harsh, but don't you ever do that again, do you hear me? Finn looked away sheepishly but couldn't fully cover the smile on his face. Binnen shook his head. Ah, come here, little man. Finn still felt weak as he carefully sat up, but hugged Binnen tightly. Not so little anymore. Finn mumbled into his shoulder. Binnen swallowed thickly, willing himself to keep his composure. You'll always be little to me. Finn snorted and pulled back to look around when a wave of dizziness hits him. Whoa. The teenager put his head in his hands as the elderly man steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. I'm fine. You are, but you're still weak. We need to get some proper food into you today. Why don't you lie back down and I'll get you some stew? Binnen offered. Finn opened his mouth to reply as he lay back down, but a swish of skirts from the other side of his mat interrupted him. Well, look who's finally decided to wake up. Mara smiled down at him and handed a bowl of stew to Binnen. Hi Mara, Finn greeted her sheepishly. Mara grinned at him knowingly and finally sighed, all right, I admit it. I should have listened to you. You were right. Binnen stifled a laugh with his hand at Mara's preening expression. And don't you forget it. Mara sat down beside him and checked his temperature with the back of her hand, then inspected his tongue. You seem to be healing quite nicely. How are you feeling? Finn shrugged dismissively, I'm okay. A little hungry, I guess. He did experience some dizziness after he sat up. Binnen explained in a grandfatherly way. Finn stuck his tongue out at his friend and the old man cutely waved at him. Mara snickered at their antics and replied, yes, dizziness is one of the after effects. You need to take it easy. I'm giving you permission to move around but very carefully and not far from your mat. The hall is mostly clear of the ill now, so I may have you and Inga Jorgensen moved to my house. Just to keep you both close. Finn and Binnen nodded in agreement, though the teenager frowned a little. He wanted to go home, but deep down understood why it wasn't yet meant to be. Finn. Mara smiled knowingly and stood to give Astrid room to tackle her son. The blonde slid to the boy's mat and nearly yanked him out of the sheets in a tight hug, crushing his face into her shoulder so that he began to whine and moan. Mom. Mom, I can't breathe, kinda dizzy. Mara tapped the mother's shoulder and sweetly remarked, Astrid, remember what we talked about? Zip it, Doc, I'm bonding with my baby who almost died. Astrid snipped and both Finn and Binnen guffawed in laughter. Mara rolled her eyes and turned away. Oh, what do I know? If he throws up all over you because you're handling him too much, then don't blame me. I changed this kid's diapers and worse, I can handle his puke too. Astrid announced, pulling Finn up to inspect his face and prying his mouth open with her fingers. Ache. Finn remarked irritably. Binnen snickered and the boy turned on him, still trying to pull away from his mother's probing fingers. Stuppigen, dis isn't fungi gar mom. Fingers out of mouth, that's disgusting. Ache and then the sloppy, wet. Our kisses. Make it stop. Binnen laughed heartily now at the scene, Astrid planting kisses all over Finn's disgruntled face. Finn yanked and twisted as far away from her as he could, but only became more twisted in the sheets. Astrid landed one more kiss on her son's forehead before hugging him again. "Don't you ever do that to me again. Do you hear me? Ever?" "Yes, Mom, because I totally did that on purpose." "In a way, you did. I'm keeping you on your toes. You're giving me gray hair." "Mom, I've told you this before, you'd still be beautiful." Benen snorted, "Lay on the sugar. Pipe down, you." Finn poked the old man with a finger. Astrid hugged her son one last time, pulling him tight to her chest. "I thought I was going to lose you. I was so scared." Finn sighed softly and embraced her warmly. "I'm not going anywhere, Mom." He then smirked mischievously. "I've got so much work to do if I'm going to drive you and Dad crazy one day." "Ha ha ha, you are so funny, Finn." Astrid pinched his cheek. She laughed suddenly and pinched both of his cheeks, stretching them outwards to show his teeth. "Ha! Benen, look." Benen leaned over and raised an eyebrow, confused at the scene until he took note of Finn's unamused expression in the boy's eyes. The old man laughed and shook his head at Astrid. "What on earth are you doing to the poor boy? Hasn't he had enough? Hiccup, and I used to do this when he was a baby. It's still cute with his pudgy little cheeks." Finn finally snapped his head back. "Mom, seriously. This poor boy has handled quite enough this week." Fine. Finn scrubbed his face with his hands for a moment before grimacing. I need a bath." Astrid's eyebrows shot up. "What? My little Finn admitting that he needs a bath too? What is this world coming to?" He. Finn gave her a false smile. "Hilarious. Anyway, where's Dad?" He was helping some families move back into their homes earlier." Benen replied, his eyes milling the hall. "He didn't sleep much last night, so I know he got up early." Finn tisked his tongue and shook his head. "That's a terrible habit to get into. Someone should talk to him about that." Astrid snorted and began folding a few blankets. "How about you tell him yourself? You take a little walk around the hall with your stew and I'll go find him." "Nah, it's okay. I'll see him later. I don't want to badger him." "It's not a problem." Astrid insisted and stood. Finn raised an eyebrow as she planted one last kiss on his head before turning toward the doors. "Don't stray too far from your mat. And eat all your stew. And listen to Benen." "Mom, I'll be fine." Famous last words, fearless Finn. Benen chuckled when the teen stuck out his tongue. "You keep doing that, it's going to get so long you will be able to touch your nose." "Good. It'll be less work to pick my nose that way." Benen grimaced. "That's disgusting." Finn snickered and pulled himself onto his knees. "I'm just kidding." "Wow, I will never take the ability to stand up straight for granted again." Benen stood and helped the boy onto his feet. Finn frowned when the room tilted to the right and he could feel a slight pressure behind his eyes. He quickly discovered that shaking his head only made the dizziness worse, so he opted to carefully walk to the nearest bench instead. "How do you feel now?" Benen asked. Finn shrugged and accepted the bowl of stew his old friend offered. "Everything's tilting to the right, and kind of downwards. It's weird. It's not intense, but I don't know. It feels like I spun in a circle for a few seconds and then stopped. Everything's spinning, but not intensely." Benen nodded. "Best be careful then and don't eat that too fast." Finn shoved his spoon in his mouth heaped with potatoes and venison. He hummed and pulled the bowl closer to his chest as if it were treasure. "Odin bless the hands that hunted this game and created this masterpiece." Benen chuckled and patted the boy's back. "That would be you. That's the buck you shot down while you and Helga were out hunting." Finn rolled his eyes and grinned. "Ah yes. Then Odin bless me." Benen ruffled his hair with an affectionate smile. "He already has." Chapter 17, More questions, more answers. Chapter text. Her first thoughts focused of the pain radiating throughout her head, neck and shoulders. Her body felt stiff and genuinely uncomfortable. No amount of tossing or turning helped. With a sudden frustrated huff, She snatched her pillow from behind her head, punched it a few times to fluff it up, and then set it behind her head again. There, much better. I've never seen someone massacre a pillow before. Inga's eyes snapped open and she froze. The first problem, she wasn't in her room. The second, there was a boy in the room with her. The third, she dearly hoped she was wrong, but that boy sounded like. She turned her head to the right and in the adjacent bed sat the red-headed boy whom she so despised, a small book propped on his knee and a big smirk on his cocky face. Haddock. The raven-haired girl nearly spat. Finn grinned and turned back to his book. Jorgensen. Inga growled and gritted her teeth before tearing her gaze away from that side of the room to stare at the ceiling. What are you doing here? A better question is why you're so petulant after sleeping for so long. Oh. Haddock used a big word. Inga smiled in fake sweetness. Are you reading one of your sister's big girl books? Finn scowled and twisted the book around. It's a shortened copy of the Dragon Manual. Basically the only thing I read. He rolled up his long sleeves. Besides, Mara wanted me to read in hopes that the dizziness would go away, or something. Inga frowned. Dizziness. I was sick and still fighting off some of the after effects. Why the heck are you in here if you were? Inga paused in disorientation. Slowly, she sat up and took in her surroundings. Mara, we're at Mara's. She remarked dumbly. Yes. Finn glanced at her from his book, pretending to be uninterested. However, he was slightly panicking because she wasn't supposed to wake up while Snotlout was away. Why? She turned to Finn in utter bewilderment and turmoil, a look that Finn had never seen on her before. What happened? Why am I here? I can't remember. Finn licked his lips and opened his mouth to reply, but she continued, panic evident in her voice. I can't remember anything. I don't know what happened. Why can't I, Finn? I can't remember. Why can't I remember? Finn didn't know what to be more shocked about, the fact that the normally very collected girl was panicking or that she actually used his name. Hey, he slid into a sitting position. He groaned and slammed a hand onto the small bedside table when his vision swam, but he forced himself to focus on the horrified girl in front of him. Inga, look at me. He spoke calmly. Inga lifted her head from her hands and looked at him, her arctic blue eyes wide with fear. Finn felt something in his chest constrict. Suddenly, he wanted to rid the terror from her, no matter what it took. It's okay, Finn reassured softly, you're all right now. What happened? Inga whispered. Finn didn't want to tell her everything, it wasn't his place. He took a careful breath and reassured her. You went to get the aloe for medicine. Do you remember that? Inga paused for a few seconds before gingerly nodding. You had an accident. But I think it would be best if your parents told you. Where are they? They stepped out a couple of minutes ago. Your brothers needed them for something. I'll see if I can find them. Finn set his book down and slowly stood, trying his best not to appear weak in front of a girl, especially Inga. He strode toward the door with deliberate steps, and just as he grabbed the handle, everything spun. Inga watched as he groaned in annoyance and pain. He put his head against the door frame with his eyes closed. Are you okay? She asked gingerly. Finn sighed and shook his head. Everything's spinning. Then don't go out. Inga pleaded. It's not that important. Yes, it is. Finn stood up straight. Trust me, talk to your parents while you're awake. They need to see you. With that, the Haddock boy opened the door and strode out. Mara wasn't anywhere to be seen, and he knew she would have his hide for stepping out, right alongside his mother and Binnen. But deep down none of that mattered. He had to find Snotlout and Heather. It was worth the extra bouts of dizziness and discomfort to see them happy that Inga was finally awake. Finn stepped out into the midday heat. The sun's rays blazed through his skull, only reminding him of his dull headache, but, nonetheless, he walked into the square. The boy turned in a careful circle in search of the Jorgensens, willing himself to stay standing and ignore the way gravity shifted his mind's eye. But his freedom was not to last. Fearless Finn Haddock. The teenager jumped and whipped around, his hands out to steady himself as Mara stomped toward him from the bakery. What in Odin's good name? Before you yell at me, Finn interrupted with a single finger in the air. He turned and pointed toward her house, or its general direction anyway. Inga's awake, wants her parents. Mara's mouth shut and she crossed her arms grudgingly. Well, I suppose that is ample reason enough to do something stupid. Yes. So without further ado, I am going to return to my bed. Finn gave her a mock salute and walked away. Finn. Yeah. My house is the other way. Finn smirked. Yeah, but mine is this way. I did say my bed, right? Mara did not seem to be pleased with his humor today. I'm going now. Mara enjoyed his pout as he walked back into the house and closed the door, then turned toward the village to locate the Jorgensens. Finn slumped against the door when it clicked shut. He rubbed at his eyes, willing them to focus on something. He stood there for nearly a minute until Inga broke the silence from her bed. You look terrible. Finn gave her a dry look. Thanks. So do you. The only difference is I make this look good. PSH. Inga tossed her head, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. Haddocks are all psychos. And Jorgensens are cocky. Who are you calling cocky? Easy there, beauty. Finn smirked as he lay back onto his bed. Inga gritted her teeth. I told you not to call me that. Hey, chillax. Most girls would love a compliment from me. Must be because you're so lovable. Careful, might wear yourself out with all that sarcasm weighing you down. Wear myself, I'll have you know that I could run circles around you. As opposed to squares. Ugh, Haddock. Finn laughed at the ceiling, absolutely loving the torture he was putting her through. He didn't know why, but she was so fun to tease. Maybe it was the 3-year age gap, maybe it was the generational, semi-serious feud between their families, maybe it was simply because he was a guy and she was a girl. Whatever the reason, he simply couldn't pass up the opportunity to irritate her. The funny thing about it was no matter how much she could really grate on his nerves and how honestly, irritatingly, obnoxious she could be at times, she could keep up with his antics. He appreciated anyone who could keep up with him, even if it was Inga Jorgensen. The redhead sighed, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. Someday, beauty. Inga huffed at the ceiling. Someday what? Someday you two will love me. Finn turned to her and nodded with every ounce of confidence he possessed. Inga raised an eyebrow, undeterred. Just like everybody else, you'll finally see me for who I really am. Oh no, I'm already well aware of who you are, Finn. Inga looked up at the ceiling again when his blue eyes turned toward her. Cocky. Driven. Finn interrupted. Inga scowled and continued, overachiever. Hard worker. Proud. Confident. Spoiled. Blessed. Brat. Angel. Oh gods. Inga huffed, making Finn laugh once more. If you seriously think you are an angel, gods help us all. The girl narrowed her eyes at the laughing boy. Would you shut up? It wasn't that funny. I'm hilarious and you know it. Obnoxious. Witty. Inga massaged her temples with her fingertips gingerly. Shush. Just shush. I don't take orders from girls. Sure. As I always say, beauty. Haddock, so help me Thor. A man should be free to lead his own destiny. Shut up you stupid boy. Inga screeched, launching herself from her bed and throwing all of her weight into her arm. Her pillow smacked Finn in the face once, twice, 3 times before the sound of the door opening caused her to freeze. Inga. Snotlout nearly charged in and crushed her in his arms. Heather and Mara stood in the doorway gobsmacked at the sight of Finn sprawled on his bed with Inga standing over him with a now flat pillow. Heather shook out of her stupor and hugged her daughter tightly after her husband. Hi Mom, Daddy. Inga smiled at them widely. She could see the dark circles under their eyes and the worry etched in their faces. How are you feeling? Snotlout asked gently, brushing her dark hair out of her face. Well, I was fine until I had to beat someone senseless to shut him up, ahem. Inga jerked her chin toward the Haddock boy a few steps away, who naturally waved. But honestly I'm stiff and overall kind of groggy. Mara inspected the girl's joints and was pleased to note that her injuries seemed to be healing nicely. She doesn't seem to have any problems with movement. We still need to take it easy though, day by day. Mara instructed, leaning over to glance at the suddenly quiet Finn. She flicked his shoe to get his attention. Hey, are you okay? Finn peeked out from under his arm. I'm okay. Just tired. Now who's worn out? Inga smirked. Finn grumbled in response, but didn't try hard to make a proper comeback. Both of you have had hard weeks. Mara patted the girl's shoulder. But while you're awake, let's get you some food, we can talk to you about everything that's happened, and we can give Finn some quiet time. Do you need anything before I go, Finn? MMMFHH. Finn grumbled from his elbow. I'll take that as a no. Holler if you need me. Mara ushered the Jorgensens toward the door, Snotlout carefully walking his daughter into the front room. So how long was I out of it? Inga asked the moment she and her parents were alone. About 3 days, maybe 4. I'm not sure, they all blend together. Heather explained. We didn't sleep much. Sorry I freaked you guys out. But I'm okay now. Inga said cheerfully. Heather and Snotlout exchanged a brief glance before turning back to their daughter. Inga felt her stomach constrict. I am okay, aren't I? Hopefully, yes. Snotlout replied slowly, his eyes flitting to his wife's every few seconds. There was a long, very tense pause. When the Jorgensen patriarch spoke up again, both Heather and Inga started. Inga, you know we love you, right? Sure. Inga raised an eyebrow. Why wouldn't I know that? I think he meant to say that we love you no matter what happens. And nothing is ever going to change that. Heather brushed a few strands of hair from in front of her daughter's eyes. Inga's eyes widened in horror. Am I dying? No. Snotlout exclaimed a bit too loudly. He cleared his throat before continuing in a softer voice. No, Inga, you're not dying. But while you were out, something happened. Something like. Do you remember anything from the time you were out? Maybe a dream? Heather asked softly. I pretty much remember leaving to get the aloe leaves and waking up here. Inga shook her head. Nothing else. Okay. Snotlout and Heather exchanged a look again before Inga's father continued. While you were out, you had a kind of episode. Episode. 1 second you were lying there peacefully, the next you were sort of twitching and jerking around. Heather felt a flash of the fear she had on that day, and it took quite a bit of self-control to compose herself. Foaming at the mouth and sort of choking. Inga, rather than feeling fearful, was overwhelmed with confusion. What? But I'm fine. I know. Heather sighed shakily. Bennen was there and he said he'd seen it happen before. Sometimes a brain injury can cause these episodes. Now, it may have been a one-time thing, but there's a chance it could happen again. Snotlout continued, gently reaching forward and putting a hand on Inga's knee. And if it does, we're going to do everything we can to get it under control. This could happen a few more times. Inga felt a tiny prickle of fear. Bennen said that was a possibility. Heather stated, exchanging another look with Snotlout. So we thought it would be best to make sure you know. If you feel anything strange, tell an adult. Us, Mara, Hiccup, Bennen, anyone who can get you help. Inga swallowed thickly, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands. Okay, she mumbled. But it's not going to happen again. Inga. No, I feel fine. Inga insisted, her eyes finally meeting her mother's. I can't just have these unpredictable episodes. I wouldn't be able to ride Misty anymore or do Thorfist or. You could if we prepared for it. Snotlout cut in. Well, we don't have to. Inga shook her head, this time more vigorously. She ignored the aching sensation that resulted. Can we talk about something else? Inga, this is important. Snotlout exclaimed in a slightly higher register but stopped when Heather held up a hand. It's a lot to take in. But, yes. Heather fixed her husband with a stern gaze. I think a change of topic is probably for the best. As Heather and Inga began to talk about what else had been going on, Snotlout scowled. How could his daughter be so callous about what had happened? She certainly wouldn't have acted that way if she'd seen herself seizing and foaming at the mouth like a dying animal. He felt a flicker of sympathy for Hiccup. If he worried about Adriana as much as Snotlout was currently worried about Inga, Snotlout was never going to criticize his chief's parenting again. His train of thought was nearly forgotten when his daughter laughed in response to something Heather said. He loved it when she laughed. She almost always snorted and would cover her mouth and laugh harder in response. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps staying positive about the future would prevent any future episodes. Even so, he was going to keep a much closer eye on her from then on. Finn found himself lying on his stomach when he woke up, his right arm hanging off the edge of the bed so his fingertips brushed the floorboards. He heard the distinct sound of a blade softly scraping on wood. He smiled before he even moved, recognizing that sound anywhere. Binnen. His elderly friend looked up from his seat a few feet away with a big smile. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty." "Good morn." Finn flinched and looked up. "It's morning." "Yes. You apparently fell asleep around 5 yesterday evening and didn't wake back up. Mara said better to let you catch up on sleep. Do you feel better?" Finn yawned and rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, I do actually." He pulled himself into a sitting position and smiled in realization. "Hey, the dizziness is gone." Binnen smiled widely. "Good. I'd still take it easy though. It may come back." "Don't worry, Binnen. I don't think I'll be pulling any real crazy stunts anytime soon." Finn replied as he untwisted the cord on his necklace. He touched the wood fondly for a moment before looking at Binnen with a prompt look. "I'm starving." Binnen laughed and set his carving aside. "Then let's find this strapping young man some food, shall we?" "Sounds perfect." Finn followed Binnen out the door and noticed the Jorgensen family eating breakfast by the fireplace. He gave a short wave and received a greeting from the twins first. Inga raised a critical eyebrow at him with a certain mischievous look, but if she had any roguish thoughts about his survival from last night's pillow attack, she kept them to herself. "Heading out?" Mara asked from her table of herbs and medicines. Finn shrugged. "Can I? I don't see why not. You look a lot healthier, standing up straighter already." Mara smirked when Inga snorted from the fireplace. Finn leaned toward Binnen and whispered, "She knows she likes it." Snotlout stiffened. "Don't be getting any ideas, Haddock." "I wouldn't dream of it, sir." "Snotlow, Mr. Jorgensen." "Yeah." Binnen and Snotlout smirked while Inga buried her face in her bowl of oatmeal, trying not to laugh out loud. Finn was sure his face had never been redder. He cleared his throat promptly and managed, food." "Great haul." "That's fine with me." Mara nodded. "Just stick with Binnen and come back if you start feeling woozy again." "Thanks, Doc." Finn grabbed Binnen's sleeve and nearly dragged him to the door. "Come on, let's go." Finn skipped out into the morning light and inhaled the chilly morning air deeply. "Freedom." Binnen laughed. "Free from sickness, the healers, or the icy Jorgensen stare?" "Hey, pipe down," Finn commanded with a finger poke to Binnen's stomach. "I'm just hungry, need some food." "Yeah." A snort from the old man was the first response, then a flat, "Yes, food." "That's the problem." "What are you going on about exactly, Ben?" Finn began. "Finn." The teenager turned in time to see a blonde attack him from the side. Helga hugged him tightly around the neck so that he almost couldn't breathe. "What, Helga?" "Hey!" Finn exclaimed in surprise as he reciprocated the hug. "You're okay?" Helga squealed delightedly. "Oh, thank gods. Of course I'm okay. What, did you think a few germs could possibly slow MMMF?" Finn was rendered unable to finish his sentence when Helga immediately grabbed his collar in her fist and yanked his head down to her level. The boy was used to her forcefulness, but he was surprised to find his lips meeting hers in a sensation that could best be described as, actually there was no proper description for this. Finn wasn't entirely certain of what was going on. His eyes widened as Helga moved her lips against his, and then something clicked in his mind. Heat rising to his face, he shut his eyes and wrapped his arms around her. His heart was pounding so loudly, he was surprised she couldn't hear it. Was this even happening? Surely this had to be some kind of surreal fever dream. But even if it was, it wasn't a bad dream at all. Actually, it was rather nice. With a small pop, their lips separated as suddenly as they had met. Finn's eyes fluttered open and, for a moment, all he could see was Helga. She, too, seemed to be focused on him. But alas, this was not to last. Finn could see Benen's amused grin out of the corner of his eye and, with a thrill of horror, his parents walking up to the young couple. He cleared his throat. So I was saying. Finn stumbled through his words, not altogether sure his lips were working properly anymore. I was saying something. I think you were about to ask if I was busy for breakfast. Helga chirped cheerfully, enjoying the gobsmacked expression on his face. It's your lucky day, fearless Finn, because as it so happens, I'm not. Oh, well okay. Yeah. That's cool. I'll catch up with you in a sec, Finn said, allowing Helga to hurry up the steps to the hall. He turned to Benen. Don't say it, he growled through gritted teeth. Benen let out a chuckle, apparently unable to hold it back any longer. You. Astrid complained as she walked up to him, Hiccup laughing by her side. Gross. My eyes. I can't take it. Hiccup, who was walking alongside her, threw his hand over his eyes. It burns. It burns. Come on, I was never that bad. Finn griped with a scowl on his face. Believe me, we're not even close to done. Hiccup clapped his son on the shoulder. Now why aren't you hurrying after your lovely damsel? What do you want to hang around us for? I was. Finn began but trailed off with a frown on his face. He eyed Benen for a moment but seemed to decide not to finish his sentence. No reason. As Finn hurried up the stairs to see if he could catch the Ingerman girl, the smile melted off of Benen's face. That boy. He mumbled. At Hiccup and Astrid's look of abject confusion, he smiled once again. I'm sorry. I just didn't think he'd grow up so fast. Thank you for reminding me. Hiccup deadpanned. Benen let out a chuckle. Yes, I'm sure time does seem to zip by for you. But these last few years have gone by so quickly. It's hard for me to adjust to the fact that Finn is becoming a young man. He's burned into my mind as that cheerful little boy I first met. Try constantly having to remind yourself that he used to be the size of a loaf of bread. Astrid sighed deeply. He was so cute. Yeah, now he's a little too handsome. Hiccup remarked dryly. I don't know where he got that. As Astrid tittered in response to this, Benen kept his eyes fixed on where the boy had been standing moments ago. He furrowed his brow as he made a decision and then turned to the Haddocks. Do you think we can talk in private for a few minutes? He asked quietly. There's something I should have told you and time is going by so fast, I shouldn't put it off any longer. For Finn's sake mostly. Is this about what we talked about on Snoggletalk? Hiccup asked apprehensively. Oh, no. Nothing's changed on that front. Benen smiled amiably at Astrid's look of confusion. I'll tell you in a second. But this is concerning another matter. Is something wrong? Hiccup put a hand on Benen's upper arm. Because if we can help at all. No. Benen said firmly. Nothing is wrong, at least not in the way you're implying. But Finn. He audibly swallowed and looked Hiccup in the eye. There's something that happened a long time ago. Something I probably should have told you. But Finn is still so young and this isn't the sort of thing he needs to know right now. But later on, it could save him from a lot of heartache. I just fear that I won't live long enough to tell him myself. Both Hiccup and Astrid felt a wave of deep sadness at the thought of losing Benen anytime soon, but they understood his urgency. There was no telling how long he had left. Here, we can talk in the forge. Gobbus at breakfast. Hiccup beckoned his wife and elderly friend as he sauntered over to the small building. Thank you. Benen nodded to him. He paused for a moment before speaking up again. I never thought I'd be so nervous to talk to you. What's there to be nervous about? Astrid asked in concern. I know that you see me as this wise old advisor who always has the answers. But the truth is, I didn't get this way on my own. I had to make a few mistakes and learn some lessons the hard way. Benen glanced around the forge to make sure no one was listening. There was one mistake I made that I'm deeply ashamed of to this day. And I don't think I could live with myself if I didn't do everything in my power to protect Finn and Anna from that kind of pain. Then we're listening. Hiccup said kindly. Benen smiled warmly. Though his heart ached to even think about what he was about to tell them, he was deeply touched that they cared enough about him to listen and about their children to make sure what he had done would never be repeated. Eric wasn't the sort of person who had big emotional outbursts, but when he did, he usually regretted them hours later. But not this time. The Larson boy was intrigued by his anger at his former best friend. In his head, he knew it wasn't truly her fault. The odds of Olaf surviving even after receiving the cure were slim considering how bad the sickness had gotten. But the rage he contained seemed to consume every last bit of his heart, and she was the only one to whom he could channel it. It helped that he had felt so strongly about her before. Turning his infatuation into burning anger was so easy, it was almost unnerving. Was this really where almost exactly 10 years of friendship had to lead? Eric didn't know. And he didn't want to find out. He had been working since it happened. The smell of leather and the sensation of it in his hands helped calm him. His mind was free to wander where it pleased when he was working. And right now, he was determinedly thinking about anything except Adriana Haddock. Even his breakfast would be a preferable subject for his mind to fixate on, but it simply wasn't meant to be. Eric. Eric jumped so violently, he nearly knocked the saddle he was working on off the table. Horst took a step backward. "I'm sorry," he said, feeling rather guilty that he'd distressed the boy further. "I'm about to close up. Probably best to head home." "Go ahead and close up. I just want to get this done," Eric said through his teeth. Horst sighed deeply and shook his head. He had no idea how to deal with adolescents, much less grieving ones, but Eric had been working since the early morning. And the dark circles under his eyes were practically speaking for themselves. "I think you should go home and go to bed," Horst firmly stated. "If you don't get some rest, you're going to wear yourself out. You saw what happened to Finn." A tiny spark of anger ignited inside of Eric's chest, but he choked it down. "I'm not sick. You will be if you work yourself to the bone." Horst took a step forward and placed a hand on Eric's shoulder. "I know this is hard. I lost my father at a young age too. But this isn't how to deal with it." "Then how am I supposed to deal with it?" Eric gritted his teeth and forced himself to stay calm. Horst gently squeezed the boy's shoulder. "You need to be with loved ones. Isolating yourself won't do anything. If this is about Adriana, it isn't overtly about her, but she is part of the equation. I have nothing to say to her," Eric said flatly. "If that's what you wanted to talk about. I just wanted to make sure you're not neglecting your own needs, Eric." Horst shook his head. "And I don't think what you're doing is healthy." "Well, you're not my father," Eric spat. "So you can't tell me what to do." Horst forced down the lecture about being respectful to one's elders that nearly poured out of his mouth the second his apprentice had spoken. "No, Eric, I'm not. But I know what you're going through and..." "Maybe, but that was, what, 30 years ago?" Eric rolled his eyes. "Forgive me if I don't jump at the chance to listen to your anecdotes." Horst's patience was wearing thin, and he knew his wife would be cross if he came home late after everything that had happened. He patted Eric's shoulder as gently as he could before taking the lamp next to the work table. "Horst, I can't see anything. You'll be able to use the sunlight tomorrow. Now go home, Eric. Don't make me drag you." Horst's voice was beginning to sound rather gruff as his irritability shone through. "Fine, fine." Eric stood up quite suddenly and stopped only to grab his satchel before stomping out of the shop, muttering darkly. Horst watched him go for a few seconds before packing up his own things. True, Eric had always been a hard worker and fun to talk to since his mind always seemed to be miles away. But this wasn't the boy he had trained. And though he knew that the grieving process wasn't to be rushed, he also knew his apprentice fairly well. This went a bit farther than grieving. And though Horst didn't know much about Eric's history, suddenly he began to wonder if there was more to his story than he had originally thought. Astrid awoke for no apparent reason so early the next morning that it was still dark out. She moaned in annoyance and tried to snuggle closer to Hiccup only to discover that he wasn't there. She patted the bed beside her before sitting up, her brow furrowed in confusion. What on earth was he up to at this hour of the night? She quietly put on her slippers and tiptoed down the stairs. There was light coming from the cracks in the door of Hiccup's workshop. But unlike the clanging and occasional muttering to himself one could usually hear when Hiccup was hard at work, there was silence. Hiccup. Astrid slowly opened the door and peered in. Hiccup was sitting at his workbench and rummaging through the drawer under the table. He looked up when Astrid spoke. "Sorry if I woke you," he mumbled, turning his focus back to his apparent search. "What are you looking for?" Astrid asked in confusion. "Some more purple thread." "I know we have some," Hiccup said absent-mindedly. "Go on back to bed. I'll be up soon." "That thread is purple." Astrid pointed to a spool he'd placed on the table. "It's not the right shade," Hiccup replied without even looking up. "It's okay, really. I'll find it." Astrid was about to frustratedly retort that now wasn't a good time to be doing anything except sleeping when she caught sight of Hiccup's project. On the table was the mangled hair flower Adriana had yanked off hours ago. Its lilac shade certainly differed from the royal purple thread on the spool to which she'd pointed. "Hiccup, come on up to bed," Astrid said in a gentle voice, stepping up and placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fix it tonight." "Yes I do," Hiccup mumbled through his teeth. "It'll still be there tomorrow." "This can't wait." "Why not?" "Because it's ruined," Hiccup snapped, finally lifting his head to stare at his wife. Astrid was taken aback at how exhausted he looked. Hiccup took a deep breath and looked over at the flower. "I knew it would be her favorite because it's the purple one, so I wanted it to be perfect for her." Astrid's heart sank at how anguished her husband sounded. And it was. It was so beautiful and it looked amazing on her. And now it's torn and destroyed. And if I let it sit there in pieces without doing anything to fix it, it'll always be in pieces. And I can't just throw it away and make another one. I could never replace something that precious. His voice shook on the last few words and a tear slowly fell down his face. Astrid felt her heart break for her husband as she watched him trying, and failing, to push down the emotions building within him. "Hiccup. I just have to fix something," Hiccup shakily whispered before wiping his face and continuing to rummage through the drawer. Astrid watched him go through the spools of thread for several seconds before she got on her knees and joined him. He paused for a moment to kiss her on the forehead before getting back to his work. A part of him was deeply thankful that Astrid understood. And it was that tiny spark of something positive that kept his eyes dry as he continued to try to fix what was left of his daughter's gift. Chapter 18, Vita Pro Vita. Chapter text. Hiccup felt like he had been let off the hook as the days progressed. The families and friends of those who had died had respectfully declined his offer to perform the funeral and had, instead, made other arrangements. He was proud of his people for doing what they needed to do and for freeing up his time to do some damage control. But Berk's chief had intentionally put off one sad duty that had fallen to him as Chief Olaf's funeral. Because Olaf's sister lived on Braun, it took a few days to contact her and even longer for her to come pay her respects. Anra Larsson Sommund was younger than Olaf by several years and, like her brother, had the gift of putting those around her at ease. Even Erik was acting somewhat normal a few hours after she had arrived. The funeral itself had been difficult to sit through. Olaf's ship burned so brightly in the moonlight that it resembled the setting sun. No one noticed Adriana standing in the back, leaning against the side of a house and silently wiping tears from her eyes every few seconds. No one, that is, except Erik. Rather than give her the usual glare, he simply started at her for a few seconds and turned to Magnus again. Adriana knew it was wishful thinking to assume that she and Erik would be friends again anytime soon, but she was at least glad he didn't hate her for being there. In the wake of a tragedy, sometimes it can be a little bit unnerving how fast life goes back to normal. Within a week since Hiccup and Adriana had returned, those who had been sick had almost completely recovered. The blizzard had damaged a lot of buildings and it took a few days for the temperature to rise enough that the snow softened, allowing the Berkians to begin repairs. Soon, that became the most important task, and all able-bodied hooligans were working on the reconstructions required. A full week after Hiccup and Adriana's return, Benin woke up feeling rather odd. It wasn't an unpleasant sensation, or even a physical one at all, but it was sort of a feeling that today was significant. He blinked a few times, staring up at the ceiling of his small house, and found himself deep in thought. It certainly wasn't his birthday or a holiday that he could recall. But today seemed vitally important for some reason, and the elderly man wasn't at all sure why. He supposed he would know soon enough. He rose from his bed a lot earlier than usual and ate breakfast at a leisurely pace, knowing that he wouldn't be needed until much later that morning. His dragon was out hunting and wouldn't be back until that evening, so, after getting dressed, he decided to take a walk around and enjoy the crisp morning air. The midwinter chill on Berk was colder than any place he'd ever been, and he had come to love it because it always reminded him to be thankful for his freedom. This morning was no exception. Benen's house was close to the leather shop, and he was surprised to see someone working in the window. It was certainly too early for the non-essential sort of jobs like healing or standing guard over a public place. Surely the owners of the saddles or outfits that needed repair weren't that impatient. Benen strolled over and rapped lightly on the window. He could make out Eric so hard at work, one might have thought he was making up for a lot of lost time. The boy lifted his head and furrowed his brow at the sight of Benen in the window. Nonetheless, he walked over and opened it. "Need something?" he asked dismissively. Benen took in the Larson boy's haggard appearance. His eyes had dark circles under them, in fact his whole face seemed to droop completely. He was hardly recognizable as the wide-eyed teenager who greeted customers with a friendly smile. And he was far from the boy who pretended he wasn't staring at a certain blonde girl every time she passed by. "Not particularly. But I think you do," Benen said with a small smile. "When is the last time you had some company other than Horst?" "Why does that matter?" Eric shook his head when his eyelids began to droop. "It doesn't if you're all right." Benen leaned in and rested his elbows on the windowsill. "But I can tell you're not. I just want to be alone," Eric said in a rather dead voice, turning back to his work. "Ironic that oftentimes we want to be alone when we most need other people." Benen watched Eric work for a few seconds, admiring the boy's precision. "How you're feeling is completely normal, Eric. And I wouldn't dream of trying to change that. But you can't begin to recover if you don't share that burden with others. I know from experience that keeping emotions that powerful to yourself can cause you to make some very bad decisions." "I knew this was going to come back to Adriana," Eric growled in a low voice that Benen almost didn't hear. "That's all anyone ever talks to me about. Go apologize to her, tell her how you feel, salvage your friendship. Gods, it's relentless." "I wasn't going to say anything of the sort." Benen smiled softly. "Although I do agree with their points, I suspect that that's not what you need to hear right now." "So what do I need to hear?" Eric asked, cursing his curiosity since he really just wanted to be alone. "That it's not always going to hurt this much." Benen leaned in a bit more so that Eric could see him in his peripheral vision. "Sure, you'll have moments when you feel like you are never going to feel happy again, but they will pass. Every day is a little bit easier if you allow yourself to grieve and to heal." Eric opened his mouth to ask how Benen knew this, but immediately shut it. He knew enough about Benen to know that the elderly man had suffered the kinds of losses no one, least of all him, could possibly begin to understand. And yet there were days when it seemed like Benen had always been upbeat and happy. "Maybe," Eric said, feeling like he needed to respond. "Please don't allow this pain to consume you." Benen's voice was more tender, more grandfatherly as he said this. It wasn't a word of advice, it was a caring plea. Eric wasn't at all prepared for this, so he remained silent. Benen waited a few seconds before continuing, a look of deep sadness etched on his features. "You will only make it worse. The longer you stay angry and depressed, the more it will eat you up inside. The consequences of letting that happen are always, always devastating. It may be easier to isolate yourself from others, but you're only hurting yourself in the end." "Why do you care?" Eric asked in a slightly shaky voice. "You don't even know me that well." "Because I believe you're stronger than this." Benen leaned in even more. And I don't want you to push away people who love you enough to go through this with you. You're talking about Adriana again. Eric gritted his teeth and turned back to his work. Yes, I am. Binnen admitted unabashedly. And I'll keep what I have to say brief. She's a special girl, Eric. One of the most brave, most resilient people I have ever known. If anyone can help you bounce back, it's her. Sure. Eric said dismissively, trying to ignore the burning anger he was beginning to feel. Take your time. Sort through what you feel. Binnen sighed. I just pray that when you do see what kind of a profound impact on her life you've made, it won't be too late. She's resilient, Eric, just like I said. She will bounce back. I really don't want to talk about this. Eric began to try to make himself look busier. I'll leave you be. But just remember what I said. Binnen stood up straight but didn't close the window. I've been watching you these last few years from afar. You have the potential to be a great man and I know you will be one day. I have complete faith in you, Eric. With this, Binnen strolled away. Eric looked up and watched his retreating back for a full minute before standing up and closing the window. As he recalled what the elderly man had said, he let out a derisive laugh. Great man, huh? Binnen was clearly a crazy old man who had convinced himself that he could read people like a book. But he couldn't. Because Eric knew very well that he would never amount to anything. And no encouraging words would ever change that fact. Adriana's flower had been a particularly difficult object to fix. It had taken every ounce of precision Hiccup had, not to mention a few nearly sleepless nights. But fix it he had and it looked good now, almost like nothing had happened to destroy it. He was timid about approaching his daughter, who had been rather cold to him since losing Eric as a friend, but he was so pleased with his work that he had to take the chance and hope that Adriana would forgive him. It was just before noon when he tapped on the girl's door. Addy. Millimeter. Adriana hummed in response. Can I talk to you for a second? Fine. Hiccup walked in and nearly smiled at the sight of his daughter propped up on a few pillows and reading a book. The amount of times he'd seen her doing that were too numerous to count. She didn't look up as he slowly sauntered forward, keeping an eye on a resting Lily at the foot of the bed. I thought about what you said. Hiccup began, his fingers fiddling with the flower. You're right about the promises I've broken. And I'm not going to pretend like I haven't messed up with you. I have. A lot. Some of it was my fault and some of it wasn't anyone's. Adriana hummed again in response. I know this doesn't even begin to make up for letting you down but, well he held up the flower, maybe it's a start. Adriana eyed the flower in his hand for a few seconds before turning back to her book. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. I wish you hadn't. What else do you want me to do? Hiccup asked, exasperation beginning to take over. Are you always going to keep punishing me for mistakes I made raising you? I've told you that I'm sorry 100 times. Sorry isn't enough. Adriana lifted her book so her face was partially obscured. Hiccup sighed deeply. You know. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. People can only be pushed so far. You know that as well as anyone. But if you keep this up, if you keep hanging on to this, you're going to end up alone and unloved. That's what happens when you let things like this consume you. His voice was firm, which surprised the girl a bit. Every minute you hang on to this, you push away people who love you. One day, there won't be anyone left. Don't let that happen. Hiccup left the flower on the top of her dresser before walking out, confident that he had made his point. Adriana, however, read the same line several times before she realized that she wasn't paying attention to her book anymore. Alone and unloved. Was that really what her father had said? The same man who told her that he loved her unconditionally had just made it abundantly clear that his, and everyone else's, love hinged on this one condition she couldn't meet. How could she turn off her brain to nightmares and flashbacks? Was she really going to lose everyone because of one horrible thing that had happened to her? The answer hit her so hard, she gasped in surprise. She already had. Eric's rejection, her father's broken promises had been her fault for letting this take over her mind. For being an unlovable burden on them as she tried to move forward. Gone were the days when she could be openly candid with her father in the early hours of the morning. He was clearly close to the breaking point. She had already pushed Eric too far. As angry as she was at her father, she couldn't bear the thought of pushing him away too. The Haddock girl made a silent resolve to fix this. If it meant sleepless nights to stop the nightmares, she would do it. If she had to go out of her way to take risks and build up her endurance, she would do it. She was never going to mention this again or let it control her. She could beat this. She had to beat this. Otherwise she would lose everything. She thought about going to her